well. Yeah, so we'll get our first keynote underway. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Merrick Burrow, who's Principal Lecturer in English Literature at the University of Huddersfield. And his research interests are primarily in popular fiction of the late 19th and early 20th century. And he's published articles and essays on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, something of an expert on Conan Doyle. And he's currently writing a book on detective fiction, magic, and the history of deception, which sounds such a fascinating area. So I'm really looking forward to that. So I contacted Merrick directly because I was so excited about the Cottingley Fairy exhibition, which is forthcoming at Leeds Brotherton Library. Obviously, it's a difficult time for exhibitions, etc. But hopefully Merrick will be able to update us as to when we might be able to attend. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Merrick Burrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to hopefully share my screen. And let me get this up. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to this conference. I very much enjoyed listening to the papers yesterday, and I'm looking forward to the rest of today. So just to give you a bit of an update, the exhibition on the Cottingley Fairies at the Brotherton Library, the Treasures of the Brotherton Library Gallery at the University of Leeds, was due to launch last September, and for obvious reasons we weren't able to do that. We've been preparing a reduced online version of the exhibition, which is going to be available online later this month on the Leeds University Library channel on Google Arts and Culture, I am told. I was hoping that we might have it up in time for this conference, but there were some hoops that we had to jump through for Google Arts and Culture. So, but hopefully it won't be too much longer. And the plan is for the Treasures of the Brotherton Library Gallery itself to be open to visitors in May, all being well. And because of the delay caused by the pandemic, the gallery has agreed to extend the exhibition into 2022. So if you do get the chance to travel up to Leeds, it'll be available to see for quite a while. So what I'm going to do today, I'm hoping is to whet your appetite with some images from the exhibits while tracing one of the thematic strands that runs through it. The exhibition has been created mostly from the Cottingley Fairies archive in the Brotherton Library special collections at the University of Leeds, although there are a couple of items that we've borrowed from the National Media Museum, these being one of the original cameras that was used and another that's the same model but not actually the copy in question. The archive was bequeathed by the estate of Edward Gardner, who, along with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, first brought the Cottingley Fairy photographs to the attention of the world in the pages of the December 1920 issue of the Strand magazine. The archive contains glass negatives of the 5 fairy photographs, together with most of the correspondence between the key parties, prints, publications, and newspaper clippings. It's quite an extensive collection, and in selecting the items for inclusion in the exhibition, I wanted to do justice to the multi-layered stories of the people involved. My core conception of the story is that it was an accidental conspiracy. There's no question that deception was perpetrated. It was the longest running and arguably the most famous hoax of the 20th century. In their own way, each of the protagonists in the story contributed some sort of deception, which they mostly kept to themselves for their own reasons. But it seems clear that no one intended to produce a hoax of such scale and consequence. I'm taking it for granted that at a conference dedicated to fairies, the basics of the story are well known enough for me not to need to rehearse them in detail. Instead, I want to explore a couple of features of the story that tend to get flattened out in the standard narrative in which a famous detective fiction writer in his dotage is hoodwinked into believing in an obvious fraud by 2 young girls. The first point that I want to challenge is the assumption that Conan Doyle was uncritical or easily deceived, though deceived he undoubtedly was. It's important to understand that the fairy photographs had a very specific significance for Conan Doyle in relation to the controversies that had raged between spiritualists on the one hand and scientific naturalists, or materialists as Conan Doyle referred to them, on the other, in the wake of the First World War. As the terrible loss of life piled up, people turned to spiritualism and seances as a way of coming to terms with the disappearance of a generation of young men who had left home and never returned. In the case of many, including Conan Doyle, the loss was added to by the heavy death toll of the influenza pandemic that followed in the wake of the war. The idea that the dead had moved on to another plane of existence was obviously a comforting thought for bereaved relatives. The suggestion, moreover, that their spirits could be contacted and even photographed via a synthesis of occult powers and modern technology was powerfully seductive. Such a situation was also, obviously, ripe for fraudulent exploitation. These controversies can be traced back at least to the table-turning craze of the 1840s, and even further back to the vogue for mesmerism in the late 18th century. But in the wake of the Great War, the disdain of materialists for the paranormal was boosted by a sense of moral outrage at the prospect of grieving parents and wives being conned by unscrupulous charlatans. Conan Doyle's interest in the Cottingley fairies was always secondary to his commitment to spiritualism, but he could see their strategic value to his cause. He thought that if people could believe in fairies, it would provide a gateway to accepting the existence of the spirit world. The circumstances in which Conan Doyle came to hear of the photographs involved a hefty element of chance, but once he had seen them, he immediately grasped their value in the temper of his times. He looked at them through the lens of the skepticism that was directed at mediums and spirit photographers. From this perspective, he could see no obvious motive for fraud in making the fairy photographs, and no pursuit of pecuniary advantage. The fact that the photographs had been taken by two girls bestowed a sense of innocence on the images. Unlike spirit photography, the fairy pictures were not directly related to the trauma of war, which also freed them from the taint of opportunism. The Cottingley fairies provided an opportunity for Conan Doyle to shift the terms of the debate decisively away from questions of fraud, or so he thought. The other idea I want to challenge in this talk is that the fairy photographs were an obvious fraud. It's worth reminding oneself of just how remarkable the photographs themselves are, and it is to this that I now turn. The first photograph on the left is of Frances Griffiths, aged 9, taken in July 1917 by her 16-year-old cousin, Elsie Wright. The second photograph on the right is of Elsie, which was taken by Frances 2 months later. In both instances, it was the first photograph that either girl had ever taken. This alone makes them remarkable accomplishments, but they are also surprisingly sophisticated images, technically and aesthetically, particularly the first one of Frances and the Fairies, or Alice and the Fairies. The name Alice was used in the original Strand magazine article as a way of disguising or protecting the identities of the family. To illustrate my point, it turns out that it is not actually all that easy to draw and cut out such convincing fairies using card and hat pins, or knitting needles in my case. I attempted to do so for a video I made last summer for the National Science and Media Museum, with results that are, I think it's fair to say, mixed. To do this using non-digital equipment, without the opportunity to immediately review and retake images, and with access only to a primitive camera and a single photographic plate, is nothing short of incredible. You might like to try it yourself if you have a spare afternoon, which I promise you will leave you with a renewed sense of respect for Elsie Wright's artistic abilities. But the remarkable quality of this photograph is also partly down to its composition, which is structured around the undulating wave of the fairies across the middle of the frame. Considering that it must have been put together as an intuitive arrangement, the group of figures conforms remarkably closely to the golden section ratio that frequently appears in finely composed works of art and architecture. The two fairies on the left of the picture trace a line that intersects with that of the bank, which continues through Frances's forearm, dividing the picture diagonally. The angle of Frances's wrist meets that of the arms and wings of the fairies on the right of the picture, in parallel with the first, creating a central X shape which frames Frances's face. The light catches it from the top left, emphasizing the contours of her features, which are framed also by her braided hair. Frances is not gazing at the fairies before her, nor directly down the barrel of the lens, but slightly above it, where her cousin is holding the camera and looking down into the viewfinder. Contemporary commentators found this odd. Why was she not looking at the fairies, they asked. But the anomaly was explained away because of the shyness of fairies, who don't like being looked at directly, apparently. From a purely visual point of view, the effect of Frances's Mona Lisa expression defines the mood of the photograph, in which her enigmatic smile enhances the overall mystery of the scene. And then there are the fairy tale details of the mise-en-scène, the toadstools, ferns and harebells, and the blurred white cascade of the waterfall over Frances's left shoulder, which contrasts with the sharpness of the dark foreground from which the fairies pop out. I'm spending this time analysing the image partly in order to defamiliarise it and restore to it some sense of what made it seem so remarkable to its first viewers. Because, as we all surely know, the question most asked, aside from how and why Frances made the pictures, is quite banal. Why did Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, take such an easily detected fraud seriously? People often express incredulity that Conan Doyle was taken in by what they consider to be an obvious fake. The fact that the photographs were taken by two working class girls who lived in a semi-rural village in the north of England has multiplied the factors by which Conan Doyle has been shamed by his detractors. It's easy to fall into this way of thinking, not least because Conan Doyle was in various ways complicit in his own deception. But we should be wary of participating in the prejudice that underpins such judgments. A little reflection on the images themselves might at least refresh one's sense of how remarkable they are, and how highly improbable it must have seemed that such extraordinary photographs had been faked by two such girls. Douglas Kerr, Doyle's biographer, remarks bluntly that everyone knows Conan Doyle made a fool of himself over the case of the Cottingley fairies. Kerr's use of the word case suggestively hints at the stark contrast between Conan Doyle's assessment of the photographs and the verdict one might expect from Sherlock Holmes, upon whose acumen his reputation chiefly rests. A contemporaneous cartoon in Punch magazine made the same point. It depicts Holmes chained by the ankle to his creator, whose head is lost in the clouds. Beneath the cartoon, a satirical poem speculates on what that great sleuth must make of Conan Doyle's late defiance of the laws of science. But go back to 1887, when Arthur Conan Doyle published the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet. In July of the same year, he also published a letter in the spiritualist journal Light, asserting his belief in the veracity of the paranormal. In his letter, Doyle writes, "After weighing the evidence, I could no more doubt the existence of the phenomena than I could doubt the existence of lions in Africa, though I have been to that continent and never chanced to see one." So much is well known and has been widely discussed before. Conan Doyle's endorsement of the fairy photographs was, in this respect at least, perfectly consistent with his career-long ability to sustain a commitment to scientific principles and to a confident belief in the paranormal. The idea of Conan Doyle becoming a dupe in his dotage is also challenged by the evidence of documents included in the exhibition, especially in the correspondence between Doyle and Gardner. These letters tell a different story, which has its roots in the polemical debates that Conan Doyle entered after his public conversion to spiritualism in 1916. Gardner, I mentioned, is Edward L. Gardner, who I will come back to and talk about in a few moments. Conan Doyle maintained an active interest in spiritualism and psychical research throughout the rest of his life, becoming a member of the Society for Psychical Research in 1893 and remaining active until shortly before his death in 1930. But it was not until 1916 that he decided to announce publicly his conversion to spiritualism, delivering public addresses on his new revelation in 1917 and publishing his first spiritualist tract under that title in 1918. He soon began to enter into debates and controversies with anti-spiritualists, such as this For and Against piece in the Strand magazine from 1917. For his part, Conan Doyle argued that the eminent physicist Sir Oliver Lodge was right to conclude that he really had communicated with the spirit of his son, Raymond, who had died in the war. Edward Clodd, his opponent in the debate, argued firmly against. Following the publication of the article, Conan Doyle wrote to his opponent, saying, "Dear Clodd, I was amused by our turn-up in the Strand. I have one great advantage over you, because if I am right, and know I am, I can say when I meet you hereafter, 'Hello, Clodd, what do you say now?' Whereas if you were right, you could never get in your retort." At this stage, Conan Doyle's approach to debate was one of friendly rivalry, with a desire to find common ground. His joke about them meeting in the afterlife is thus followed by suggestions for Clodd to investigate particular psychic experiments and spirit mediums, which he believes will provide the evidence to change Clodd's mind. This letter is pasted into Clodd's personal copy of his own book, Refuting Spiritualism, which he characterizes as a movement with tainted parentage that he describes as having grown up in an atmosphere of fraud which still clings to it. The copies of Clodd's anti-spiritualist works, which will be on display in the exhibition, are all filled with newspaper clippings and angry handwritten marginalia as he followed Conan Doyle's ongoing prognostications about spirit communication and the afterlife. On the left, for example, Clodd has clipped a review of The New Revelation, in which the reviewer recounts how the late Frank Podmore took Conan Doyle to some seances, thinking that his ingenuity in his detective stories would make him a competent judge. He found the medium easily fooled Conan Doyle. On the right is another clipping concerning exposures of fraud in seances, with handwritten comments on Conan Doyle added in red underlink and critical comments in the review underlined. Clodd's crusade against spiritualism in general, and Conan Doyle in particular, continued unabated. In his book Occultism from 1922, he quoted a reviewer who wrote of Conan Doyle's extraordinary inability to grasp the principles of scientific investigation, opposite which he pasted in a cutout page from the original Strand magazine article, including the photograph of Iris, that's Elsie, and the dancing gnome. The controversy continued to rumble between the two men. In February 1920, Clodd launched a scathing criticism of spiritualism in The Graphic, which drew Conan Doyle's ire. He responded with a full frontal counterattack on Clodd and his arguments in the following week's issue. In addition to Clodd, Doyle encountered opposition, hostility, and ridicule from many others. He engaged in increasingly ill-tempered and often condescending letters to newspapers in response to unsympathetic articles and correspondence. In March 1920, Doyle participated in a public debate at the Queen's Hall with Joseph McCabe. Like Conan Doyle, McCabe was a lapsed Roman Catholic. In fact, he had been a priest. But where Conan Doyle had pursued spirituality via an interest in the occult, McCabe became a radical atheist. He co-founded the Rationalist Press Association, a polemical organization whose aim was the overthrow of religion in general, but of spiritualism in particular. Edward Clodd was also a member of the RPA, whose members had a particular hostility to Conan Doyle and to spiritualism, which they argued could only be sustained by acts of deliberate fraud on the part of mediums and spirit photographers. When it came to the public debate, Doyle and McCabe conducted themselves according to the normal conventions. Doyle felt they had been evenly matched, but he had just about come out on top. A verbatim report was duly published for the edification of the public, but McCabe immediately followed up with his own published account, in which he, as he puts it, drastically examined the arguments and evidence that Doyle had put forward, and which he published under the title, "Is Spiritualism Based on Fraud?" Doyle responded in a tit-for-tat manner with his own drastic examination of McCabe. So by the summer of 1920, Doyle's attitude towards his materialist opponents had shifted decisively. He viewed them no longer as interlocutors to be persuaded, but as enemies to be defeated in battle. As a long-standing war correspondent, Conan Doyle began looking for a strategy to outflank his enemy. Francis and Elsie's fairy photographs had been the subject of family controversy in 1917, but the girls had refused to admit that they had been faked, and so nothing came of them, at least until the spring of 1920, when Elsie's mother took them to the Bradford Theosophical Institute after hearing a lecture about fairy life. They quickly came to the attention of Edward Gardner, a senior figure in the Theosophical Society, who made copies for his use in public lectures. And soon afterwards, they were brought to Conan Doyle's attention by the editor of Light magazine, David Gow. Conan Doyle wrote to Gardner to make enquiries. His interest in the photographs was ostensibly for an article he was writing for the Strand magazine, part of a series on the paranormal called The Uncharted Coast. But when Doyle wrote that the photographs should be epoch-making, it seems that he has something more in mind. That expression, epoch-making, was used in the subtitle to the article in the Strand magazine later that year, in which the first two Cottingley Fairy photographs were published. But Doyle adds a caveat: if we can entirely clear up the circumstances. Doyle was about to embark on a lecture tour of Australia, spreading the vital message of spiritualism. But he was keen still to continue to wage his war on materialism. He corresponded and met with Gardner on several occasions, and concluded that he could be entrusted with responsibility for investigating the circumstances of the fairy photographs. Gardner produced a report in which he summarised Francis and Elsie's social and domestic circumstances. Gardner also wrote that he had permission from the families of the girls to use and copyright the photographs as he saw fit. He had also secured the cooperation of a photographic expert, Harold Snelling, who had 30 years' experience of practical photography. Snelling, Gardner wrote, was willing to testify that the photographs were genuine and unfaked, and that there was no trace whatever of studio work involving card or paper models, dark backgrounds, painted figures, etc. In addition to the testimony of a photographic expert, Conan Doyle also sought out critical opinions. Given his experiences over the previous few years, he understandably was reluctant to show them outside of like-minded spiritualist circles. He sent copies to an associate named Kenneth Stiles, whom he considered a fairy authority. Stiles was sceptical about the photographs for three reasons. The first was the quality of lens needed to produce such an image, which he believed would have cost no less than 50 guineas. The second was the fashionably Parisian coiffure of the fairies, which seemed suspicious. Finally, Stiles reported he had received a vision from his spirit guide in which he saw a man surrounded by photographic equipment faking the pictures. Gardner and Doyle seem to have treated all 3 points as equally valid, concluding eventually that Stiles' spirit guide had in fact shown him a vision of Snelling examining the photographs. When Sir Oliver Lodge expressed his own misgivings, Doyle was respectful, but felt confident that he and Gardner were, as he puts it, sufficiently on our guard against fraud. In fact, Conan Doyle was approaching the publication not just defensively, but in terms of military tactics of attack, flanking, and counterattack against his materialist opponents. A suitably warlike metaphor appears in this short note to Gardner from Australia, in which Conan Doyle jokingly depicts him sitting on a time delay mine. "I expect I will hear the boom over here," Doyle wrote. "I hope you won't be incommoded by the explosion." A major weapon in Conan Doyle's arsenal, and the main reason why the likes of Claude and McCabe were so vociferous in their attacks on him, was his status as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. The publicity for a spiritualist pamphlet, The Vital Message, in 1919, had puffed Conan Doyle as the author of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, as well as The New Revelation. Since the early 1890s, the Society for Psychical Research had enjoyed the advantages of having the implied backing of Sherlock Holmes when it came to evaluating the mysteries of paranormal phenomena. But as Doyle became increasingly entrenched, the relationship became strained. By 1920, they were becoming extremely nervous at the implications of Conan Doyle giving his endorsement to the photographs of fairies. J. Arthur Hill, the personal assistant to Sir Oliver Lodge, wrote to Doyle after having had the photographs analysed. Hill's photographic expert was sympathetic to psychical research, but was still of the opinion they were fakes, pointing out the drawn outline of one of the fairies' faces. Hill astutely observed that the testimony of Harold Snelling stated that the photographs were not double exposures or studio work, but gave no reassurances that they were not paper cutouts photographed in situ. He pleaded with Conan Doyle to reconsider publication, suggesting that the whole thing might be a honey trap set up to discredit not only him, but the whole edifice of spiritualism and psychical research. The letter's quite badly damaged, but this is what he says in the key passage. The father, that's the father of Elsie Wright, is a materialist of sorts, and it would be pie for the Rationalist Press Association, Ed Claude Ray Lancaster and co., if they get Sherlock Holmes's creator to take seriously a thing which is a hoax. They will say, moreover, that if you can be taken in, we weaker brethren, who are not as versed in criminology, need not be considered when we trot out our own evidence. But Conan Doyle was not swayed by Hill's arguments, which he considered typical of the SPR's overcautiousness. Instead, he prepared himself to draw out his enemies, whom he reassured himself he will be able to overcome with his own counterattack. The first two photographs had been taken with Elsie Wright's father's Midge camera. It was only a very basic camera. More importantly, though, there had been no experimental controls when the first photographs were taken. Conan Doyle knew this was likely to be identified as a weakness in his case by his critics, and yet he left this vulnerability wide open as the Strand prepared the first article for publication. In the meantime, Conan Doyle sent a pair of brand new cameo cameras to Francis and Elsie, together with a package of secretly marked photographic plates. These would enable Conan Doyle to prove there had not been any photographic trickery, of the kind that had been exposed in relation to fraudulent spirit photographers. When Gardner had the second set of photographic plates developed, he was delighted with the results. They showed more fairies, but also, and equally importantly, no evidence of tampering with the marked plates. This seemed especially significant in respect of the fifth and final photograph, the fairy sunbath, in which the semi-translucent figures of fairies and elves appear in a kind of nest or bower in the grass. Such spectral effects were associated with double exposure, and in spirit photography, this was where marked plates had been used to expose fakery. Of course, this only really made a material difference if the entire process was being closely scrutinized. There was no need to switch plates if opportunity was available simply to create a double exposure on plates that had been sent in the post. Gardner and Doyle were excited, however, to be able to show the appearance of rigour, even where such rigour did not really exist. When Conan Doyle received the news on October the 21st, he wrote back to Gardner saying that his heart was gladdened when out here in far Australia I had your note and the 3 wonderful prints which are confirmatory of our published account. There was time yet to include the additional photographs in the first article, but the prospect of doing so was never raised because it had never been the plan to do so. Once again, Conan Doyle refers to the first article as a delay action mine that he had left behind on departing for Australia, and for which he tells Gardner he had felt guilty. But now he felt his gambit had paid off. The second set of fairy photographs would serve as a complete shield against those attacks which will very likely take the form of a clamour for further pictures, unaware that such pictures actually exist. Conan Doyle published the first 2 photographs in triumphalist mode as an epoch-making event, in full knowledge of the likely reaction of McCabe, Clodd, and the rest of the Rationalist Press Association, and indeed that's confirmed by the marginalia and clippings in Clodd's books, which clearly show a violent reaction to the publication of the fairy photographs, perhaps more than anything else. The second article was published in March 2021. It is for the most part unremarkable, an assemblage of anecdotes and legends about fairies with no direct connection to the Cottingley photographs, apart from the publication of 2 of the second set of pictures. The text of the article was for the most part beside the point. What mattered was the appearance of the second pair of pictures. This was intended to be Conan Doyle's counterattack. In a separate letter to Sir Oliver Lodge, written before the publication of the first article, Conan Doyle explained his strategy. He wrote, "I can't think what the materialists will make of them. We will draw their fire with the first two and then produce the other three." In the end, public reaction to the publication of the fairy photographs was mixed, but it is fair to say it was not the decisive victory that Conan Doyle had been anticipating. The insularity with which he conducted his investigation, the manifest confirmation bias in his interpretation of facts, his refusal to distinguish between empirical and testimonial evidence all tell badly against him. The whole episode is an early example of what Cass Sunstein has called enclave deliberation, that kind of groupthink that happens when borders around conversations are closed off and people only speak to people that agree with them, which has become so familiar and so toxic in our contemporary political culture of fake news and social media bubbles. At the same time, these kinds of bubbles also offer cognitive and experiential spaces within which it becomes possible to imagine alternative ways of living and being. It is perhaps the idea of the latter that accounts for so much of the enduring appeal of the Cottingley Fairies. So did Conan Doyle make a fool of himself over the Cottingley Fairies, as Douglas Kerr suggests everyone already knows? In one sense, the answer is obviously yes, but only if we treat their status as fakes as a matter of fact, as Bruno Latour might say, rather than trying to understand their significance when viewed as a matter of concern. One aim of the exhibition is to restore this sense of why the photographs mattered so much when their status as fakes was not yet certain, and when the stakes remained high for the people involved. The Cottingley Fairies connect us not only to the controversies of Conan Doyle's personal war on materialism, but also to the trauma of national mourning a century ago, and the need that people felt then, as we do now, to find respite in the transformative possibilities of stories and images. Do the Cottingley Fairies remain a matter of concern today? Judging by the level of interest that news of the exhibition has inspired, clearly they do. Conan Doyle helped to transform these remarkable photographs from a domestic practical joke, which would by now have been long forgotten, into enduring images with global resonance. And the lingering sense of uncertainty about the hoax still remains. Frances Griffiths continued to insist until her death that the final photograph, the fairy bower, or sunbath, was not a fake, and that she really did see fairies by Cottingley Beck. Conan Doyle would perhaps have been amused. It would, at least, have given him and Edward Clodd something to talk about in the hereafter.
Thank you, Merrick. That was absolutely wonderful. It's so wonderfully detailed and scrupulously researched. I've really learned a lot from that, so thank you so much. One thing I'd like to ask initially, I'm sure there's going to be some questions coming up in the chat. I want to still allow 10 minutes for questions because it's been such a wonderful presentation. I'm sure everyone's got questions they would like to ask. So if you would please post something in the chat. I just have something initially that I'm particularly interested to know. I was very impressed by obviously all the handwritten and typewritten letters that you've managed to assemble. It's so wonderful and special to be able to see them. And I wondered if you could, I know maybe there's little secrets of the exhibition, but I heard through the grapevine that you have actually got the camera that the girls used for the photographs, Arthurite's camera. Is that true in the exhibition?
We weren't able to get the Midge camera. We've got another Midge camera, which is the same model. But right. the problem we had was the National Science and Media Museum have it as part of an existing display, and so they weren't essentially willing to kind of undo the existing display in order to lend it to us for a year. Yeah. But they also had a number of copies, well, not copies, but other examples of the same model. So they lent us one of those. But they did also not long before the plans for the exhibition were finalised, purchase one of the cameo cameras, so the ones that Conan Doyle and Gardner gave to the girls to take the second group of photographs. So they very kindly lent us that, because that wasn't part of an existing display. So we've got that and the midge to put on display in the exhibition. So yeah, we're quite excited about that.
Yeah, that's on.
Lots of negotiation over insurance policies.
I can imagine. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward. And you've got some of these wonderful letters and archive.
Yeah. All the letters that I included are going to be on display. There's lots of other things as well. There's various prints and publications and other things that are included, and indeed more of the correspondence. I just sort of picked out the ones that are particularly helpful to try to sort of trace that theme that I was looking at today. But there's quite a lot in there. The difficulty really was sifting it, and there was so much in the archive that there were lots of things I would have liked to have included, that you have to kind of pick out the stuff that's going to tell the story in the clearest way. Yeah,
of course. There's a question in the chat about fakes, actually. It says some people in the wake of the photographs tried to replicate the fakes. Will the exhibition include some of those attempts?
We haven't got any of those included, no. It's very much focused on the contents of the archive itself. So the only exceptions to that are the cameras, which we negotiated with the Science Museum. I mean, when we first conceived of the exhibition, I was looking at what other kind of tie-in events for public engagement we could do, and one of the things I wanted to do was a more kind of family-oriented event or school-oriented event, and getting kids to come in and sort of make their own versions of the Cottingley Fairies. It was one of the reasons why I decided to try and make my own kind of versions of the fairies photographs. So it's going to run into 2022, so we'll have to see how it goes. But if that sort of thing becomes possible, we might do that, and that will be a useful thing to incorporate some of those images, because there is quite a sort of venerable tradition of people replicating those or attempting to replicate those things. And the thing that always strikes me about them is just how amazingly good the originals look in comparison to everybody who tries to copy them. It's so hard to achieve that.
I think it's so it upsets me when people dismiss them as hoaxes and fakes, partly because they're just such a wonderful they're so important to the history of photography apart from anything else. And the girls, like you say, the skill involved in those paper cutouts, it's just incredible. I think you were talking about is it Elsie, the other one that had the artistic training or worked in a studio? Yeah,
Elsie, I mean, she was quite a talented artist, and had spent a lot of time drawing fairies when she was younger anyway. I mean, I think that the first photograph of Frances and the Fairies has a particularly interesting story behind it that again we sort of talk about in the exhibition, but the negatives that are in the Brotherton Library, the glass negatives, which I kind of approached with this almost kind of quasi-religious reverence when I first sort of picked the box up and took them out, and I was sort of amazed that I was being allowed to handle them. But it turns out they're not actually the original negatives from the camera, that Harold Snelling, who authenticated them, or for Conan Doyle and Gardner, was also commissioned to improve them for Gardner's lantern slides. And so he put them through this process of improvements and changed them quite significantly. So one of the reasons why I think Conan Doyle's fairy authority, Kenneth Stiles, was sort of thrown off by the quality of them and thought that it would have required this amazing expensive lens, is because they'd been through about 5 or 6 stage process of photographic enhancement by one of the leading practitioners in the field at the time. So again, it's one of the reasons why it's such an amazing photograph, is because it, from a technical perspective, it's been massively worked on. But the composition and the cutout of the fairy models was all really Elsie Wright's work.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful to know. Thank you for that. Just looking in the chat, there's lots of inquiries about what the dates of the exhibition are again. Maybe you could just mention that. I know you mentioned it at the beginning, to clarify it for people. I think everyone's really excited about this exhibition now. Yeah,
so we've been given permission to reopen the Treasures of the Brotherton Library Gallery on, I think it's the 17th of May. But that's all dependent on, the national situation and the regional situation. But assuming that things open up as they're planned to, then that will be opening up, from sort of mid-May onwards.
That's wonderful. Yeah, just looking at the chat again. Anna's put that it's interesting that you draw comparisons between public mourning in the 1920s and public mourning now in the wake of COVID-19. Have you noticed any similar artistic movements against materialism or towards the fairy in modern times? It's a wonderful question.
It is a wonderful question. I wish I had a good answer for it. I haven't particularly, but then I don't suppose I've really been looking for it. It just really strikes me that there is one of the things that I think is really interesting about the fairies is, what, particularly on the centenary, is kind of looking and saying, well, what can we recognize in this moment which now seems so distant?
Yeah.
Why does it still matter to us? Why? Because the interest in the exhibition and the Cottingley Fairies is has been immense. And when I was making I mentioned I made a video for the National Media Museum, and I sort of went down to the stream nearby where I live and was sort of filming myself with a camera sort of perched on the bank with these little cutouts, and two women walked past walking their dog and asked understandably what I was doing, and we got chatting. We ended up talking for about half an hour about the Cottingley Fairies, and it just seems like one of those things that everybody knows about and finds fascinating. And it's it's interesting to think why that is. I think in the context of why Conan Doyle was so interested in them, and seeing them not just as this kind of whimsical thing, but sort of deeply related to stuff that really does come out of the First World War and that experience of loss and mourning. It's nice that in a way that it produces this rather joyous kind of thing, rather than it being purely funereal. That the fairies are an interesting, or turning to the fairies, an interesting kind of sublimation of that sort of relation to death and loss. Yeah. I think, but I don't honestly have a good answer to that question, unfortunately.
I think I tried to say something in my paper later about what I think the legacy of Cottingley Fairies is. So,
well, I look forward to that. You'll have a better answer than I have.
We'll see. I'll make this the last question because of the time constraints. But there's a question from Steve about the aesthetics of the photographs. Was it done on purpose, and were there any photographs that were discarded? So were there any fairy photographs that we didn't get to see or that weren't made public?
No, I mean, this is one of the things that's so incredible about them. And they were given, for the first two pictures, they were given one photographic slide each. And, Elsie Wright's father was very reluctant to lend his precious camera to them. It took a lot of, badgering and so forth. And in the end, he gave them one camera and said, one slide, and said, if they mess it up, that's it. And they came back with that picture of Francis and the Fairies, which he developed in the, in the dark room in his pantry. And then they were sent a bunch more plates later on. I think they were sent about 24 plates, and they returned 3 that they got pictures on. But what happened to any negatives from that, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't actually know where the original negatives ended up. There's an interesting kind of story there where they kind of went backwards and forwards, and at some point they disappeared. So they could still be sitting in somebody's attic somewhere in West Yorkshire, or possibly in London. That'd be an interesting find.
Oh, any credible thoughts on that note? Yeah. On that note, I'll say thank you, Mary. It's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed this morning's session.
Thank you very much. I'll look forward to your paper later on.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Hello, everyone. So just to let everyone know that I'm going to be your chair in this session. So if I could just ask that everyone who's in Changelings and Motherhood, you're going to be staying in this session. And if the first speaker, Samantha Crane, if you're here, make yourself known. It feels much like we are in a spiritualist meeting. Samantha Crane, if you can hear us, if you'd like to speak to us now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, well, I can hear you absolutely brilliantly. So I am conscious that we are running a little bit after time.
Okay, great.
So if you're feeling comfortable, I shall say, I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Samantha Crane, who's going to give her paper, Jane Eyre, Gothic Changeling, a reluctant outsider. So I'll be here if there's any issues.
All right. Hello, good morning, everybody. I hope that there's not a delay for you. There is a bit for me, so I'm hoping that settles down. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. I don't know how to do the PowerPoint with the little camera in the box in the middle, so you won't be able to see my face for most of this because I do have a PowerPoint, which I'm going to share now. So
Just to say there's no delay, and I also don't know how to do that either, so you're in perfectly safe hands.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So this is Jane Eyre, Gothic Changeling, a Reluctant Outsider. The fairy lore woven carefully through the novel functions on multiple levels, serving not only as an evocation of the Celtic otherworld, but as a useful metaphor to establish Jane's and Rochester's respective difference from much of the natural world and their consequent kinship with each other. As such, then, the supernatural in Jane Eyre, such as it is, corresponds with the best practices laid out in Blackwood's theoretical framework, in that they function not merely as machinery, but as metaphor by which to understand the protagonist's internal and emotional life, helped along in this aim by the concurrent employment of Gothic elements. The changeling is a potent metaphor for invoking both alienation and the potential for discord. It expresses not just otherness and alienation that is linked to both physical sickliness and excessive knowingness, but also the capacity of such figures to bring disorder into family units, whether or not they intend to do so. Reading Jane as a changeling is encouraged by the abundance of Celtic folklore in the text, and does not overwrite the post-colonial implications. Jane's status as a changeling figure, an interloper from the Celtic otherworld, is remarked by both the Reeds and Rochester, but with diametrically opposed results. With the Reeds, Jane is truly an interloper, one whose quietude and small stature, her lack of aggressive animal spirits, alienate her aunt and cousins, who are too worldly and hypocritical to find any kinship with her. With Rochester, by contrast, Jane's otherness is desirable and ultimately establishes her kinship with him. Rochester courts Blanche Ingram, a worldly gentlewoman who would have been at home at Gateshead, a woman whose fierce and hard eye reminded Jane of Mrs. Reed. At age 8, Jane recognizes how profoundly out of place she is at Gateshead, recalling whilst in the Red Room she calls herself a discord who had nothing in common with Mrs. Reed or her children or her chosen vassalage, thus accounting for the lack of love between them. Mrs. Reed finds Jane an interloper and uncongenial alien who is disconcertingly unlike her own biological children, leading Mrs. Reed to admit on her deathbed to hating it at first sight, the sickly, whining, pining thing that did not cry out heartily like any other child, but by whimpering and moaning elicited her husband to notice it as if it had been his own, more indeed than he ever noticed his own at that age. The picture of Jane as changeling is thus complete. She was sickly and in Mrs. Reed's eyes abnormal. Equally damning was Reed's strange attentiveness to the infant Jane, which not only equaled but surpassed the attention he had shown to his own children in infancy, mortifying his wife, who saw his inordinate fondness for his sister's child as a threat to the domestic order within her own family. All the more so when Mr. Reed attempts to pass on his acceptance of Jane to his unwilling children. Most damning of all is Reed's deathbed preoccupation with Jane and his exaction of the promise from his wife that she continue guardianship against her own inclination. Jane is of liminal gentility as the product of a mésalliance between her wealthy mother and a poor man, but even worse, she threatens to supersede Mrs. Reed's own biological children by being raised alongside them. To contain her subversive potential, Mrs. Reed omits Jane from communal activities and leaves her with the servants whenever possible, knowingly violating her promise. Jane has house room and the physical essentials provided, but affection and acceptance are consistently withheld, and she is sensible of it, even reproaching her aunt with the promise before she is sent to Lowood School, a charity institution meant to contain her subversive influence and train her as befits her station. Her banishment, however wished for by Jane, occurs after she demonstrates past efforts to contain her whilst at Gateshead are insufficient. She has attacked John Reed and revealed herself a physical threat, not merely an underminer of morale. At Lowood, there being no family structure for her to inadvertently undermine, Jane is able to grow, but her longing for, she thinks, novelty drives her to Thornfield, where, to her surprise, she finds her match. From their first chance meeting, Rochester takes the belief that Jane is of fairy kind, thinking unaccountably of fairy tales, and he half accuses her of enchanting his horse. He then exhibits no surprise to find Jane without earthly parents or memory of same, coolly answering her denial of both in a way that confirms her status as changeling. Herein, too, Rochester demonstrates comprehensive knowledge of Celtic fairy lore. He knows that it is more likely to find fairies by moonlight, they are likely to wear the color green, and he mentions also fairy rings, the breaking of which can lead to retribution exacted against a mortal. Jane's answer is equally suggestive, for she demonstrates acute awareness of fairy lore, but also asserts that the time of the fairy folk in England is over, giving a specific end date, in fact. She claims that no season finds their revels any longer, not even in the countryside nearby, the implication being that such country would otherwise be of the sort fairies could find acceptable. Rochester does not respond to Jane's refutation in that moment, yet his belief in her otherworldliness recurs when he asks her to marry him. You strange, you almost unearthly thing, I love you as my own flesh. Thus does Rochester acknowledge his own kinship with fairies, through his sympathetic kinship to Jane. His prophecy before his first marriage proposal to her, it is as if I had a string somewhere under my left ribs, tightly and inextricably knotted to a similar string in you, that if they should be separated, will be snapped, and then I have a nervous notion I should take to bleeding inwardly, has come true. For it is the strength of their attachment, in spite of the obstacles of space and perceived convention, that enables Rochester to call out to Jane and be heard by her on the moor when St. John Rivers is pressing her to transgress her nature and come to India as his wife. There is no explanation for that moment of communion outside of magic or telepathy, so that the moment is strongly opposed to the so-called realistic, yet it appears here a key moment in the text in that it drives Jane to seek Rochester again after a year's separation. At Thornfield, Jane's Celtic otherworldliness is set against the admittedly problematic corruption of Bertha Mason Rochester, though she is equally set against Blanche Ingram, whose large stature, swarthy complexion, and shallow worldliness suggest kinship with both the Reeds Jane has escaped and the living wife Rochester seeks to deny. Rather than marking Jane as inferior, her changeling traits demonstrate her fitness for Rochester, who seeks to escape his worldly ties, and so craves Jane's ability to unintentionally bring discord and threaten relationships built on the worldly status quo. However, the paradox cannot be undone. Jane's capacity for undermining formalized relationships as a suddenly valuable rather than disqualifying quality cannot prevent Jane's middle-class propriety asserting itself, forcing her to flee the heterodox position Rochester offers her. Only after the death of Bertha will Jane be able to return. Before that, Jane comes to Moore House in the Rivers family. Through coincidence, she becomes first a member of their household and then their family. Having then acquired wealth to complement her gentility in an improbable yet prosaic fashion, Jane's impulse is to pay it forward in an almost fairy godmother fashion, proposing to divide her £20,000 inheritance 4 ways, giving each of the Rivers siblings sufficient wealth to ensure their independence too, and enabling them to be her family. Throughout the text, Jane craves a family that will not find her burdensome and which she can respect on their merits, not purely out of filial obligation. She is unable to respect the Reeds, though she does her duty by them anyway. At Moore House, after her interlude of difficulty, she unknowingly finds family among her own blood, but craving intimacy when a fortuitous coincidence leaves her with a sizable inheritance, she seeks to transform distant cousins into siblings, while St. John strives to transform a quasi-sister into a wife. Jane unwillingly brings discord as one who is like, and yet not like. Jane, able to free her cousin siblings to pursue their own desires, cannot stop herself from inadvertently causing a rift. For a short time, she lives with the Rivers as an unofficial sister, but as St. John's missionary resolve grows, he settles on Jane as his helpmate missionary. The sibling bond, not being literal, cannot hold back St. John from urging his suit, a suit Jane is categorically unable to accept, spurring him to passively aggressively punish her by methods she finds exquisitely painful. The psychological states triggered in Jane's moments of punishment and subjection indeed form a significant portion of the novel's Gothic. Joined to the Celtic ore from which Bronte draws her changeling metaphor is the Gothic by which she depicts the mirroring of physical and mental space, and of the process by which metaphors become immersive, and glimpses of the supernatural become possible through Jane's perception of events, which, not being told by a third party, is still being personal and experiential rather than externally corroborated, contained within the bounds of possible. Ultimately, reading Jane as a changeling furnishes a useful metaphor by which to understand her consistent but unwilling undermining of socially sanctioned relationships, at least until she is able to secure through marriage a sanctioned relationship of her own. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Just say, really appreciate you sticking bang on time. That was very well done. And now I'm just going to ask if we could have our next speaker come up. And so Ellen O'Sullivan, sorry, just double check that you are there. Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Kaya. Thank you so much.
Absolutely awesome. In which case I'm going to hand over to Ellen O'Sullivan, and she is going to give her paper, Come Away, O Human Child, Changing Murders in Ireland in the 19th Century. So over to you. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much. I'll just share my screen there. Yeah, I think. Perfect. Okay, hi everyone, my name is Ellen and I am a first year PhD student in Sociology and Gender Studies in University College Cork in Ireland. And today I am going to be talking about changing murders in Ireland in the 19th century. And just before I begin, I'd just like to give a quick, trigger and content warning. A lot of the things that I will be discussing are quite violent, and there will be, I'll be talking about torture, child abuse, and obviously homicide too. So just a warning before I get started. So, belief in fairies and changelings has a long and complex history in Ireland. Fairy belief is seen in various forms, transmuting the divide between paganism and Christianity, as well as surviving many social and cultural upheavals in Irish history. Changelings represent a particularly liminal aspect of that belief, and respect for the good people, as they were called, abounded even in recent decades. W.B. Yeats defines changelings thus in his fairy and folk tales of the Irish peasantry. Quote, sometimes the fairies fancy mortals and carry them away into their own country, leaving instead some sickly fairy child, or a log of wood so bewitched that it seems to be a mortal pining away and dying and being buried. Most commonly they steal children. As long as the belief in and worry about changelings and changeling existence in human communities has been present, so too has methods of prevention, banishment, and disposal of such creatures. The presence of changelings represented a threat to the stability of the home and the community, and the response to this perceived threat could sometimes be fatal, with family relations or community members killing those they believed to be fairy struck. While changeling-related murder was not a common crime by any means, such atrocities did indeed take place around this island. This presentation will be an examination of the sociological aspects of changeling murder, examining the conditions in which such an event was prone to arise and the discourse it generated within the general public. I'll be examining the sociology of changing murder in 19th century Ireland through the lens of liminality, as it is perhaps one of the most striking themes present in changing discourse, and indeed in changing murder. A concern with borders and thresholds is apparent not only in the mythology of the changelings themselves and their duality of being both human and creature, but in more subtle sociological ways too. Changeling-related murder represents a multitude of liminal spaces, from the victim stereotypes to the ritualistic elements of the killings themselves, to the treatment of the perpetrators in the judicial system and the media. I'll begin with discussing liminality and victimhood. Carol Silver posits that personal states of liminality were particularly rich for accusations of changeling possession. The majority of the victims, for instance, were young children, but victims could also be young women entering states of transition, such as marriage and pregnancy. The appropriation of changeling as explanations of non-normative behavior, traits, or appearance also regulates disability into a liminal space, placing it in the area between worlds. Much has already been theorized and written concerning the position of disability in changeling-related discourse, and elements of scapegoating disability as an indication of fairy malcontent is clear in the court cases. So we have here in the case of the murder of Michael Leahy, killed in 1826 at just 4 years old, we can see the attempted justification of his murder by the defendants, as they claimed he was fairy struck by way of not being able to stand, walk, or speak. The liminality of changing-related murders extends to contemporaneous interpretations of morality surrounding the crimes. For example, Josephine McDonough references Andrew Lang's article in the Illustrated London News, in which he speaks of the killing of Bridget Cleary, which we'll get into in more detail soon. Lang suggests that, quote, the belief in fairies was not primitive superstition, but rather a eugenic device, really a way to remove those who were seen as weak and undesirable for an ideal society. In the 1890s in particular, the eugenics movement was gaining popularity and was considered to be a modern solution to population control and regulation. On the other hand, the practice of changing infanticide in Ireland and indeed in other colonies such as India and Canada provided good fodder for the British Empire when justifying its continued occupation and brutalism against the native peoples. And this is a nice little caricature of Ireland there. This can be seen in two ways. The first being that our belief in fairies and magic marked us as primitive and ignorant, and secondly, the fact that this belief led to people killing their own offspring were both reasons enough for the British to believe that the Irish people needed to be civilized. Liminality within the context of the killings themselves is more obvious, an attempt to regulate borders and return normality to the household and community. As we have seen, children were disproportionately victims of changing murder in Ireland, and so any discussion of changing related murder must necessarily include discussions of infanticide and filicide, which is the killing of your own child. Even into the 20th century, the practice of infanticide was appallingly common in Ireland, according to Irish writer Frank O'Connor. The early 19th century was really the peak of infanticide rates in Ireland, however, so much so that according to James Kelly, by the 1840s, it actually exceeded homicide as the primary cause of violent death. Such catastrophic rates of killings were underpinned by the closure of the Dublin Foundling Hospital in 1835, and so individuals, most prominently women, took drastic measures when experiencing unwanted pregnancy. The flourishing of infanticide and filicide rates is directly related to the lack of structural and social support, and also a heavy reliance on shame and stigma surrounding female sexuality. Young unmarried women made up the majority of the perpetrators of infanticide in 19th century Ireland, and with no access to birth control and the heavy stigma surrounding premarital sex, this version of post-birth abortion abounded. Breaching these moralistic boundaries surrounding sex, interestingly, could also lead to one being marked as a changeling due to sexual deviancy. This is an element that has been suggested in relation to the burning of Bridget Cleary, who we saw earlier, a 26-year-old woman from Tipperary who was killed by her husband in 1895 under the auspices of being a changeling. Dermot Ferreter, referencing Angela Burke, writes that a suspected extramarital affair could have been a latent motive for Bridget's murder. Quote, contemporary newspapers reported her husband as saying she used to meet an eggman on the low road. And just as an aside here, this is an interesting reference to eggs, as eggs and chickens in general were seen as forms of folk protection against fairy and changeling magic in particular. In parts of Kerry, though, where I live, the arrival of unexplained eggs, such as shells in the garden or by the door, were actually seen as omens of fairy ill intent and viewed with suspicion. As we've just seen, young single women made up the vast majority of perpetrators of infanticide in general, but how is that pattern relevant to changeling murder? Here too, the perpetrators are nearly always women. There are a few notable exceptions, obviously, in the killing of Bridget Cleary, but by and large, changeling murder was the domain of women. This is quite a fascinating inversion of gendered patterns of violent crime that we normally see. My primary research is actually in the field of contemporary masculinity studies, and the association of masculinity with violent crime and homicide in particular is what Hall calls the closest thing criminology has produced to an indisputable fact. Statistically, men commit in and around 80% of all violent crime, but historically, infanticide in general and changeling murder in particular are one of the only areas of violent crime in which women actually surpass men. This highly gendered phenomenon raises some interesting inquiries into its nature. Infanticide is often used as evidence against failed womanhood and failed motherhood in particular, with Dr. F.X. McCabe saying in 1886 that it is a perversion of the maternal instinct. MacDonagh again nuances the narrative here and alludes to the chimeric space between horror and heroism that changing murder invoked. While the killing of a child was seen as a monstrous act, the killing of a changeling was almost justifiable, again if not almost heroic, on behalf of the female killer, saving the family and the community from an abnormal and alien other. Linking this rhetoric in with the allegorical mother nation state, MacDonagh called this double discourse of both maternal martyrdom and maternal salvation. The fact that ritual was so often used as part of these killings could also be considered a liminal device. These killings represented an attempt to re-aggregate victims back to the sphere of humanity. Folk cures for changing possession are often seen in media reporting on the court cases of those tried. The killing of Philip Dillon offers a good example. The Weston Mercury here reports in May 1884 that the child was placed naked on a hot shovel under the impression that this would break the charm. Shoveling, as this method is called, was a commonly used tactic in an attempt to breach the space. Thank you. Was a commonly used tactic in an attempt to breach the space between the human and fairy realms. Often, suspected changelings would be held over hearths in the belief that the changeling would go up and out of the chimney and re-enter the fairy world. Liminality can also be employed as an analytical lens when examining the treatment of the defendants in court and the media. While they are considered for what they were, which was murderers, they are often treated with something resembling empathy, considering their status as women and as ignorant or superstitious. Their genuine persuasion that the children were not of this world is taken into account, and again is something that we can clearly see in the case of Philip Dillon, as his killers are described as being under the influence of gross superstition. This contrast between the masculine and empirical coded world of the legal system and the often feminine, rural and colonized defendants leads to an interesting expression of liminality. The duality of their positions as women and murderers is also at odds with essentialist notions of gender and the believed inherent passivity of women at the time. All in all, from examining changing murders in 19th century Ireland, we can see that the narratives that emerge surrounding the cases offer rich sources for investigating the liminality of Irish identity, crime, gender, and belief. Although such instances of these crimes being committed was relatively low, like I said, the insight they provide into the collective psyche and social reality of 19th century Ireland is invaluable. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And again, signature time. That was lovely. My mum is here, however, and she just got very upset when you got to a rather dark part. Bless her. Right, we'll move straight on then. And we are now going to have a more positive representation of the belief in changelings. So, Carolyn Roberts, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
So we're going to have Caroline Roberts doing Magical Mothering, Creative Responses to Motherhood through a Rewriting of Malakin. So I shall hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't have any slides, so I'll just get going. So my topic today is inspired by my creative response to a recent writing project, which resulted in me rewriting the Suffolk folktale Malakin as a short story called The Gift. What brought this paper into being is my developing research into the conceptualization of motherhood. I therefore approach it from two areas of my current research: creative writing and a critical exploration of mothers and motherhood. So in translating Malakin into a contemporary story, the aim was to articulate my own complex, emotional and completely individual experience of motherhood. And by expressing this through a changeling folktale with a strong sense of unknowing, and by leaving open the question of whether the child in my story is real or imagined, a fairy or a spirit, whether it dies or simply grows up, I was able to allow the reader to respond through their own perceptions and experiences of motherhood. So I argue that writing in this way, using literary fiction and the genre of folktales in a magical setting, is a means of expressing and understanding the ambiguous, shifting state of motherhood and the self. So the Suffolk folktale Malakin, as chronicled by Ralph of Coggeshall in the 12th century, is one of the earliest mentions of the changeling theme. The tale tells of a mischievous spirit who comes to live in Dagworth Manor in Suffolk and engages in lively conversation with the family there. At first they're afraid, but learn to enjoy the company of the child. Malakin requests food and they leave it in a special place for her. She allows them to see her just once, but they're not allowed to touch her. She says she's been there for 7 years, and after another 7 years, she'll leave them and return to her own family. Now, I found this story of a mysterious presence which arrives, causing much consternation, requests food frequently, talks incessantly at times, yet hides itself in an upstairs room before disappearing after 14 years. Not only resonated with my own experience as the parent of a teenager, but with the critical notion of the child who is alien to its mother. So this theoretical idea, to quote Jacqueline Rose, of the alien in our midst, explores the tumultuous nature of a mother's identity and validity, which results from giving birth to a child. The woman and child are inextricably linked as it grows within her, forming her new identity as a mother, whilst altering her own. Yet as soon as it's born, as Christova suggests, it is an inaccessible other, a stranger that she cannot know. Whatever imaginary existence the mother creates for it during pregnancy, it is an alien being, with all the ambivalence and emotion that this evokes in her. She can't influence its true nature, and as the child grows and develops, the mother's role and identity alters further, until she must relinquish it and allow the child to cross over into adulthood. Contemporary Western society does not, to quote Rose further, recognise the complex, often painful reality of motherhood. The terms mother and motherhood are cultural constructions, institutions, within which a woman's identity is inhibited by definitions and stereotypes. It's in creative writing practices that I believe a mother has an opportunity to step out of these confines, where she can articulate her own experience and present it to the reader as a true evocation of motherhood, away from whatever conceptions or expectations that the term mother or motherhood engender. As Caroline Jess Cook suggests, writing remains an essential method by which to negotiate this new identity space, further citing the powerful creative energies found in being a mother and a writer. So the ever-evolving realm of folk tales, which have been used for so long to explain or verbalise particular events or circumstances, is an ideal space in which to redress the conceptualisation of motherhood. It offers the world of the unknown and the unknowing to imagine new possibilities and to begin to step away from the social imaginary. It makes room for the reader, perhaps a mother herself, to recognise and respond from the perspective of her own experience. The writer and the reader are connected by that sting of recognition. So in my short story, The Gift, which I'll read some extracts from, a child arrives on a midsummer's eve, casting a spell over the house and its inhabitants. The curiousness of the interloper is untangled season by season as mother and daughter grow in understanding that one day the child will disappear. Now in the story, the threading of ideas and themes seeks to create a sense of the unknown. The ambiguity of an unnamed child who simply arrives finds an obvious parallel in changeling stories. But the first-person narrator, a grieving mother who has suffered several losses, adds a further dimension. She is perhaps unreliable as she tells the reader, "We had given up, you see, on our dreams and on each other. Perhaps it was that and the breathing out and resigned sighs that brought her to us, because she at last arrived." So the mother's loss is further reference to the changeling tales which may have been told to explain or justify the illness or death of a child. Here though, instead of the one-dimensional archetype of the grieving mother, the story is infused with the complexities of grief and personal experience. Whether in her imagination or in reality, the child, like a changeling, is unknown. She was a gift to us after our grief. Her eyes were the hue of green ferns and brought colour into a dark world which had left us with empty arms and heavy hearts. We hardly believed that she was real. She filled the world with unknowing and made bewildered pioneers of us both. Each day there was a new riddle to solve and a new curiousness to unravel. The story's setting, a charming old yellow house in Suffolk, which is alive to the welcome interloper, is also a character within the narrative and intended to enhance the magical story world. The mother and child always remain within the house, looking out at the world and at nature, which encroaches on it. The mother's desire to retain the child and her identity, both in pregnancy and in life, is inferred. She fears releasing it, both bodily and as it grows toward adulthood and independence. The old house stood its ground as she expanded into it, seeming to fill every room, right up to the chimney breast, where on quiet nights you could hear the crickets chirping. The sound of running feet echoed up and down the benevolent stairs, the weight of ever-growing footprints leaving their mark. The front door shut itself to protect her against the elements, as tiny draughts of chilly air crept their way in around its ancient frame. The inglenook sheltered us on the coldest days and warmed us by a crackling fire, its great oak beam bearing scars from 3 festive stockings hung year after year. So the changeling theme is clearly evoked by the child who is unknown, but to borrow from Francis Young, the Suffolk folktale Malakin is unique in that it depicts the changeling as neither a human child nor fairy or spirit. It's a disembodied soul existing between states of being. Here, this resonates not only with the child who lingers between childhood and adulthood, but with the mother whose identity shifts and changes. By the end of the story, she has learned to love the stranger who came to her, but must come to terms with it leaving by accepting her diminishing role and returning to herself. She was leaving us. It was time. Slowly the landscape began to change and the strangeness returned. Time shifted and the world became wild again, and we knew we couldn't keep her. Nothing fitted anymore. Words jarred and remained unspoken between us, settling instead upon the dim-eyed moon that gazed back knowingly. Questions were left unanswered, and some we understood were just not ours to ask. Whether the child disappears, dies, or simply grows up is ambiguous. The writer's unique experience is expressed, but the reader can interpret the story through their own, just as folktales have been retold and reinterpreted for centuries. So, as I hope this paper has shown, where the construction of the institution of motherhood and the stereotypes and definitions have failed to accurately represent the true experience of mothers, creative writing practices, developed within the realm of folktales and the magical, offer an imaginative alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. I'm now going to actually invite the speakers to see if they would like to turn on their cameras and their microphones as well for any questions. So I'm going to give about 10 minutes to 5-10 minutes to questions. So if anyone would like to write them in the chat, and I can then pose them to the speakers. I should warn, you might hear in the background sounds of children playing. I know the speakers are aware of this, but I actually have 10-month-old twins in the background, and they've woken up from their nap time. So if you can hear them, I think it's very suitable, and I planned it perfectly, and that's why my mother is here. So my mother, I'm now a mother. It's beautiful. So does anyone have any questions? I should also say that we do think the smaller / younger of the twins might actually be a changeling, but we have no decision to put him on the fire at any point. He is, however, allergic to eggs. Ooh, now I've got a question from Eliza Webb. I hope I've said that correctly. What do you guys think of the concept of the abiku, if you've heard of that, or abiku? Does it fit with your research? If you haven't heard of it, I'm going to ask Eliza if she could maybe explain a little bit more about what that is in case you haven't heard of it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, it's Elisa Webb. I'm writing a Southern Gothic novel as part of my PhD, and I came across this concept from West Africa of the abiku, a child born to die, and if you don't do something about this, it's born again and again. And I'm talking about the idea of it coming over from West Africa to the enslaved peoples in the south, etc., etc. But I just wondered, I think it's an interesting intersection with this idea of the changeling, whether you've heard of that or whether it fits in with any of your ideas. And 3 great papers, by the way, really exciting.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks, Elisa. I hadn't heard of the Abiku because actually, I would say my main research is actually not in, Victorian history or anything to do with folklore at all. So this is just a very concentrated area that I'm in here. I don't know anything really about the broader aspect, but that's definitely something to look into. That's really interesting. Thanks for suggesting it.
It's from Yoruba culture originally, so yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I know I've seen it used in one of Holly Black's texts. It is, I think it's, people are starting to be quite interested in the idea of where changelings appear in lots of differing sort of mythology, and possibly around this, well, what do you do with a child that is clearly sickly and dying? And how do you deal with that situation in a way that hopefully deals with some mother's grief? I should say twins come with really high rates of mortality for mother and babies, so that's been something that's been on my mind. Okay, we've got actually a good question that leads in from that. So we've got a question from Alinka or Alincha Babakuta saying, in your opinion, is the changing myth born more from a fear of the other or from a way to try and reconcile grief and loss, both in the loss of a child and in trying to understand shifting roles/growth, i.e. my child is now a teenager and I'm not entirely sure how to connect with them? So again, that's open to anyone from the panel.
So one thing that I find really interesting about changeling motifs and tales is that there are 2 kinds. And sometimes they're combined together, but you can sort of divide them into the 2 kinds. There's the sickly child that isn't going to live, which is of course coming from this idea of like of coping with infant mortality. But then you have the changeling that is actually stronger and more intelligent and more knowing than it should be. And you sort of have Jane combining both of these, because Jane Eyre, because she is sickly but also knowing and resilient. I'm writing a chapter right now on Wuthering Heights, looking at there are 3 changelings in Wuthering Heights, and one of them is Heathcliff, who is incredibly powerful. And so I think it's both. I think there's a way of understanding the kind of brilliant other, but also a way of understanding the sickly other, and you can combine them or not. But also I've seen some research, and I would have to look through my notes to try to actually find the citations for it. But I've seen people suggesting that the knowing changeling is linked to neurodiversity, to autism and other kinds of sort of non-neurotypical forms of gaining knowledge, and that was a way of coping with that. So yeah, there are 2 kinds.
That's I really appreciate that explanation. Do either of the other panelists have a response to that? But I think that's a really, really good way of framing it. Are the other guys? If not, I have got from Betsy Cornwell saying, I would love to hear more about the connection between changeling murders in Ireland and the recent repeal of the 8th Amendment. So I guess, Ellen, although again, anyone can jump in.
Yeah, that's an interesting, because I suppose looking at kind of what I was saying there about like infanticide in general and stuff, that obviously all ties into that type of thing. But yeah, I don't know, I haven't done any kind of looking into that or research into that, but that's definitely something that kind of could be a topic of research, 100%.
Yeah, I think so. I'm aware that in Japan there was in one area in Japan a tradition of infanticide, and indeed it was something that was actively encouraged, and it did go alongside this. Well, if you don't have contraception and you don't have an abortion, and you don't have enough food or money, it becomes a rather horrific but needs must in some situation. Now I've got a question here from A.K. Faulkner for Caroline. Have you looked into the intersection between changeling law as children becoming the other and beyond what the mother had envisioned, and trans theory, which runs along the same lines?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Just looking at that. I would say yes. A lot of my critical theory, the changeling theme is kind of quite specific to this particular project. So I'm kind of in the same position as Ellen, as that this isn't my main area of research. But in terms of becoming the other, quite a lot of my interest is in, some of it is in gender theories, and those ideas that maybe we don't need to, you know, like the labeling of genders and things like that is something I'm exploring further, and certainly with regard to motherhood. In terms of the child becoming other and trans theory, kind of is sort of wrapped up in all of that. I think it kind of ties into the idea as a changeling, as an alien, as another being. As a child, as it grows up, you can't know it, and it becomes, you know, when you think, what did it say, what was the mother envisioned, but we can only imagine what we hope for our children, or what might become for them. I guess I'm thinking personally partly here, but you know, what they choose to become, or what their own identity and how that develops, it's that's very personal for them, isn't it? And us as parents, as a mother particularly, our identity has to shift and change and accept as we go along, and grow with them. And I think being a mother, motherhood is a, you know, and that working with another person, having another being in the house, however many, you know, it's constantly evolving. That's in my experience. Hopefully, sorry, it's a bit of a long answer there, so sorry.
No, I think that's, I mean, that is a really good answer, and it is obviously a really difficult thing, because at the bottom line, all you can hope for your child is love and acceptance, but you need to provide that for them in the first place to ensure that they understand what that looks like, and how they can welcome that and have that in their life, and reject that which is not good or healthy love, or not acceptance and love in a suitable way. I can see there's lots of other questions, but there is a final question that I did see again from Betsy, which was, I think, quite a nice question to finish on for all of you, which is, do you have any favourite tales about changeling and changelings and motherhood? I thought it was a nice question. It might be a stumper.
Yeah. I can go first if you like. So I like the Brontes for changelings. I also not to sort of plug myself, but I got into this idea by sort of accidentally writing an article on Little Father Time from Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure as a changeling, but those are metaphorical. So if you want actual, like, definitely came from fairy changelings, then Holly Black's Tithe and Ironside is pretty much my favorite, I think. So and then you can also read the sort of companion volume Valiant, but it's not as directly related. But in Tithe and Ironside, the main character is a changeling pixie. So yeah.
Thank you. And from any of the other panelists, do you have any of your favorites?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say about, I think one of my favorite places to read about changeling related stories and kind of folklore stories in general is in the University College Dublin. They have the archive there from the school's folklore commission, which was set up in 1937 in Ireland, where basically it's like 100,000 school children were given the opportunity to write about folklore in their local area, and it was all archived, and you can go in and read it there, and all of their stories, and it's all handwritten in their little, like, children's writing, and it's lovely. So going into the UCD archives and looking at the school's folklore commission is a really, really nice you know, place to read about changelings and fairies in general. So yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly, just to say, I can't really think of a really specific changeling story. I would recommend a book which is something completely different, quite post-human, which is another area of my interest, which is called Follow Me to Ground, and that is a story about a woman who is grown from the earth by her father, so she has no mother at all, and yeah, that's a really interesting take on female agency and motherhood and growth. So whether that constitutes a changeling, I'm not sure, but it's a really interesting book. So.
Oh, I think that absolutely does. I think, as we found, everything about fairies, changelings, and things can be completely malleable, and there's clearly overlaps between the fantasy, folklore, and science fiction. I'm now going to call an end to this particular section. Now, I realise that technically the tea break and coffee break is meant to finish in 3 minutes' time, but I'm going to pop the link into the. There's the link to room 1 for today if you're wanting to return to room 1. What I'd probably suggest is have a check in whichever room you are planning to go into around that time. And sorry, room 2, that's the link that I meant to do. Thank you, whoever just caught that. I'll pop you a link to room 2, we're in room 1. But yeah, so if you just check in a few minutes' time and see if your particular session is starting. Otherwise, go and take a few minutes to get yourself coffee, tea, to relax if you were a speaker, and we will see you back shortly for whichever panel you're choosing after the break. Let me just put that link in there for room 2. I'll get that.
Thanks for sharing.
Other than that, guys, can I just say a huge thank you so much. Really appreciated all you wonderful speakers, and thank you so much for your wonderful questions. Do feel free to give those questions directly to the speakers if you'd like to as well. So thank you so much. Bye. Cheers.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, Gavin Davis. Gavin's an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded PhD student at the Universities of Exeter and Reading. His thesis examines the construction of imperial subjectivities in Georgian and Victorian board games. He's presented relevant papers on this and written and published on all the aspects of modern gaming cultures. His latest publication is part of the peer-reviewed book series Studies in Gaming, and the edited volume Responding to Call of Duty, Critical Essays on the Game Franchise. So without further ado, I'll let you speak, Gavin. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so mine's obviously on fairies, the Celtic revival in popular Japanese video games. Without further ado, shall we begin? Okay, here we go.
Fairies abound in Japanese video games despite having no native equivalent. As Kimiya Umura notes in the afterword to Yoshitaka Amano's Fairies, the earliest excellent example of them permeating Japanese culture was in the form of Uwada Toshi's 1902 treatise on Senyo Immortals, their closest analogue. Uwada struggled to distinguish fairies, introducing them variously as mutated butterflies, variations on an insect, and faint, fantastic senyo. When early 20th century authors like Matsumura Mineko and Sango Makoto translated Yeats's Fairy and Folktales of the Irish Peasantry, as well as the poems of William Sharp, alias Fiona MacLeod, respectively, they referred to them interchangeably as natural or bewitching spirits. In other words, fairies were inimitable, a virtue we see repeated time and again in video games from Japan. Take, for example, the luscious and vibrant Odin sphere of Vanillaware. In keeping with Vanillaware's penchant for theatricality, evinced elsewhere by the Kabuki-inspired Muramasa the Demon Blade, Odin Sphere draws heavily from an admixture of Wagnerian opera and Shakespearean plays, complete with spotlights and soliloquies. Odin Sphere takes place in a world on the brink of Ragnarok, as factions vie for control over a magical cauldron. Like Kurosawa's Rashomon, it recounts the conflict from 5 different perspectives, each reflecting their character's subjective interpretation and self-interested advocacy. Mercedes, the reluctant queen of fairyland, is one such character, and her design is equal measures reminiscent of Tinkerbell from J.M. Barrie's 1904 play Peter Pan and Cicely Mary Barker's demure Flower Fairies. Tinkerbell, specifically her Disney iteration, is apparent also in another of Vanillaware's games, the Dungeons & Dragons-inspired Dragon's Crown, in the form of Tiki. Dragon's Crown is a title replete with artistic allusions. For instance, the game's impressive backdrops recall Bruegel the Elder and Younger's depictions of the Tower of Babel and peasant life respectively. The transi on which players can resurrect emaciated corpses too bears close similarity to Giuseppe San Martino's sculpture The Veiled Christ. Its characters' exaggerated proportions are highly suggestive of Frank Frazetta's work, such as his femme fatale sorceress. But it is the game's unabashed eroticism that points to an inevitable byproduct of the fairies' glamour in Japan, namely its sensuality, which arguably derives from the paradoxical appeal fairies have. Much like the anime nubiles they're often conflated with, fairies are simultaneously seductive yet innocent. They have sexual allure, but remain untouchable. Of course, the sexualization of fairies is nothing new. Given the number of folk tales involving marriages and liaisons between humans and fairies, sexuality was always implicit. However, in Japan, the literary and visual representation is frequently more or less sexualized. Take, for instance, the prevalence of bishoujo or gal games, that is, titles predicated on interactions with young girls. These are typically life or dating simulators, typified by Princess Maker 3, a game wherein players must rear their fairy daughter to maturity, managing her mood and fulfilling her ultimate dream of becoming a human princess. As in life, success is dependent on socioeconomic status, attitude, and her treatment by the player. Outside this niche, sexualized fairies are prevalent also in popular franchises like Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda series, typified recently by Breath of the Wild's buxom and lascivious fairy queens.
Ah. Mmm. Ah. Mmm.
Moreover, the first recruitable demon in Atlas's Shin Megami Tensei and Persona series is traditionally the coquettish pixie, specified within the game to hail from southwest England and be the soul of a dead, unbaptized child.
There!
Nice! The enemy's jam!
Persona! Ravage them!
Nice! The enemy's jam!
But for the purposes of today's paper, I wish to highlight a relatively recent groundswell of Japanese games actively defying this trivialization, and which harken back to folkloric traditions of the kind Yeats documented and Sharp versified. Square Enix's bravely default trilogy of role-playing games bears mentioning for its portrayal of fairies. For example, the innocuous Aerie, who, though initially helpful, reveals that she is an agent provocateur and despises humanity, not unlike her prototype in Lilith from Akihisa Ikeda's manga Rosario plus Vampire. The scary fairy, which has its provenance in the eponymous Hebrew demon, is arguably so because she represents something often intrinsic to fairy lore. That is, fairies are forever stuck at a certain stage of life and thus envy mortals. Lilith notably desires children but is so poisonous that she must resort to stealing those of other women. What we today recognize as fairies share this unnatural longing because they too cannot bear children. As the summation of everything Victorians perceived in fairies, Tinkerbell, archetypal of the many characters here mentioned, is conspicuously the only character in Peter Pan permitted to have an adult sexuality. Met with unrequited sexual desires by Peter, Tinkerbell is spiteful, jealous, and petty, representative of a tormented hypersexuality at odds with an innocent, prepubescent asexuality in the boy who never grows up. Similarly, tragic fairies take centre stage in From Software's Deracine, a virtual reality adventure game where you play as an invisible fairy travelling back and forth through time, attempting to avert disaster at a secluded boarding school. Director Hidetaka Miyazaki cites the poems of Fiona MacLeod as a key influence, discernibly The Lordly Ones, which describes fairies in commensurate terms, crepuscular, blue-eyed, proud, and terrible. They even wield lances to siphon the remaining time of unwary mortals.
Stop right there, my dear. That time you've got your eye on, it belongs to those girls. It's not for you to muck about with.
Heavens! No! The evil fairy! Please! No! Run, Rosa! Marie? Where are you? What's happening to me? It's cold. It hurts. Help me. Marie. Kind fairy.
Like them, we the player, as the game's only, quote, good fairy, trade in time to alter the course of history, a task whose near impossibility is underscored by the game's signature tune, an instrumental rendition of Scarborough Fair, a song originally telling of unrequited love.
Kind fairy. Will you be our friend?
Up the fairy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting for fear of little men. When the 19th century Anglo-Irish poet William Allingham described fairies thus, he was replicating a belief in their capriciousness now perpetuated by popular cultures overseas. Fairies might undergo superficial changes abroad, but what remains constant is their volatility because, despite their diminutive stature, they are in essence reflective of our conflicting desires, our capacity to be, as Barry put it, quote, gay and innocent and heartless.
Thanks, Gavin. That was. Can you? Am I back on? Yeah.
You are. I got it. Yeah, I got it. Sorry. Thank you for that. Sorry about that. I didn't realise what the sound.
No, sorry. We'll try and rush on. It's Anna Miller next. The Horned Guard as an environmental image in modern fantasy literature and live-action roleplay. Anna's been involved in the British live-action roleplay community both as participant and creator for the past 6 years. Her work has been published in the Hellbore zine and in Lunar Press's academic anthologies 2017 and 2019. So I'm sorry for rushing through this, but if you don't mind talking now, Anna, that's...
No worries at all. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, I am unable to share a lot of the pictures of my roleplay shenanigans, but instead I decided to dress as one of my roleplay characters. So I hope that works for you. But thank you so much for joining me today to look at playing Fae embodying the uncanny in live action roleplay. And I would like to start by flagging up this book by Nina Young called Uprooted, in which she laments the excision of adults from spontaneous play and from shared fantasy. This is something that Francesca Burstein has mentioned in a previous panel today, how fantastical realms are seen as the domain and purview of children. I would take that argument further and say that it's not just the fantastical realms themselves that are forbidden to adults, but the very act of the participatory play and shared fantasy is seen as inaccessible to the adult individual, and we are consciously being pushed to being spectators rather than participants. One of the few places where shared fantasy is still available to adults is in LARP. And LARP, live action roleplay, is also one of the few bastions where fairies consider to be regularly evoked. So I'd like to start with a question of what do the fairies do for us in those spaces? Why do they retain so much popularity? But first, What is LARP? It stands for live action roleplay, and it is a leisure pursuit based upon the acting out of an improvised narrative in the context of a particular setting or genre. Much like Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games, you create a character which you then release into a pre-written fantasy world to interact with other characters, explore your environment, and have all sorts of exciting adventures. The key difference here is that rather than describing your character's actions as you would in a tabletop role-playing games, you actually act out what your character is doing. LARP is often compared to improv theatre, and while that is a useful comparison, I feel it also has its own drawbacks because theatrical comparisons presume the existence of an audience, which is something LARP absolutely does not have. In that sense, it is a lot more closely related to the Bakhtinian carnival. And Bakhtin writes, carnival does not know footlights in the sense that it does not acknowledge any distinction between actors and spectators. Carnival is not a spectacle seen by the people, they live in it. And everyone participates because its very idea embraces all the people. So while there are various levels of engagement in a LARP game, everyone who is in that game space will be playing. Another key aspect of LARP is that you are encouraged to explore your character's interiority. So some of your role-playing process about your character's emotions and motives will be completely internal and not picked up by other players, and that is also seen as a positive thing. In order to function, LARP needs a common frame of reference because in the process of play, so much is relegated to shorthand. And to think about that, it's helpful to think about idioculture, which is a term coined by Gary Allen Fine, a game theorist. And idioculture is a system of knowledge, beliefs, behaviors, and customs peculiar to an interacting group to which members refer and employ as the basis for further interaction. For LARPers, that would be their lived experience, of course, but also popular culture and, of course, fantasy fiction. I've asked several of my participants what they are governed by when they write settings or explore certain characters. And immediately you see just how many references to popular media people come up with when describing what they are governed by in creating these LARP scenarios. And some of these are kind of common suspects like Lord of the Rings and Narnia, but some will be there specifically to provide a certain kind of flavor. For instance, here, the land of Estragalus is a fantasy realm, a setting for one of the games I play that is very closely linked to Renaissance Italy, and that is reflected by the use of the Medici Masters of Florence TV show and also the Borgias TV show. So what about Fae? As Diane Perkins mentioned in her first keynote, in the last 20 years, Fae have taken a darker turn, a sort of reaction against both the Victorian prettification of the diminutive fairy and the Disney sanitization of the folktales. So the modern Fae are dark, sexual and seductive, cruel, and immensely powerful and controlling. And this is very much reflected in the general attitude to Fae in LARP, whether people talking about Fae in LARP will reference specific pieces of media like Labyrinth by Brian Froud, or just denote common traits that we associate with Fae today, such as them being organized in courts, and the courts often being seasonal. When thinking about Fae and LARP, some of the media that immediately comes to mind is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, it's Cat Howard's Roses and Rot, it's Rothfuss's Name of Wind, or the recent Carnival Row Amazon TV show. Thinking about the common traits that most Fae are likely to share, they will be as follows. And those are really the usual suspects for a lot of folklore and a lot of kind of Gothic fairy lore being produced today. That they cannot lie, they can't touch iron, they're very contractual and speech acts are very important to them. They're near immortal and have a very different sense of time and priorities to human characters, and that they possess certain sublime qualities, whether that is beauty or aesthetics or intelligence. The thing I have purposefully omitted from this list is that they are seen as incredibly and awesomely powerful, and that is certainly a trend that holds across from fiction to LARP experiences. But while in fiction, that power is shown through Fae relation and attitudes towards non-Fae characters, especially humans. And you can, as a reader, you can see the Fae's ability to manipulate and upstage human characters and see their awesome power through there. When your intended audience are the players themselves, the non-Fae players, it becomes very difficult to negotiate the power balance without relegating a group of characters, so the non-Fae players, into the status of secondary characters and secondary participants in the game. So I've asked some of the plot writers how that is negotiated. And one of the ways I've seen that kind of resolved is by establishing Fae interests and agendas as being completely separate from those of the players. So they will not interfere, they do not take interest in controlling humans for the sake of controlling them. They will mostly just leave them alone. Another way this is negotiated is through mechanics, game mechanics. So most LARP games, the types of participants will be divided into several categories, as I mentioned, and the two of interest to us today are the player characters and non-player characters. So player characters are me and you, people who have turned up to LARP to play. Non-player characters are usually governed by the games masters or by the pre-written logic of the world. This curtails their power, and also they are implicitly there to help the players navigate the world and explore it and have fun. One of the interviewers helpfully pointed out that non-player characters are there to, even though they can be incredibly adversarial, they're there to provide color and flavor for the game as a whole and not for their individual power trip. But as I was having these conversations, something that I have noticed while out in the field is that non-Fae characters still showed incredible deference to Fae characters in their play, even when they didn't have to. So it struck me that non-Fae characters approaching Fae showed an almost sublime awe and terror, something akin to Rudolf Otto's Mysterium Tremendum, the tremendous mystery, this sense of an encounter with the uncanny. It's often linked to Freud's understanding of the uncanny, an approach to something awesome and inspiring and fascinating, and also potentially a quasi-religious experience. So to come back to the question at the beginning of this talk, what do Fae give to us in these play spaces? It seems that they are the awesome and powerful inhuman mystery that we can approach and we can experience in our play space, when in our daily lives we are increasingly pushed to pretend like we are in control of everything we do and completely disconnected from our imaginative selves. The next portion of this talk was going to be about what the players of Fae characters experience while in the process of play. So I'm going to stop now, but if you're interested in hearing more about that, do ask me about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. I was going to try and have to cut you short now because we are running short of time. But brilliant talk. Thanks a lot. I learned a lot that I didn't know about there. So now if we can turn to Cynthia. Are you there, Cynthia?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. So Cynthia Nirmala Raja completed her MA in English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, and her BA English degree at Stella Maris College, Chennai. She's worked on the gift economy of modernist poetry for her dissertation. I'm going to have to skip some of the biog here, sorry. She's worked on the presented papers on fan fiction and on the intersemantic and interlingual translations of Harry Potter movies, lycanthropy in Harry Potter, and an eco-critical review of Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles. She's interested in comics narratives, modernist and postmodernist poetry, children's literature, fantasy, and literary criticism. Right, so thanks, Cynthia. If you can begin your talk.
Yes, thank you. I would like to start with a caveat. This is a very incomplete paper because I had to omit several very relevant and interesting points and aspects because of the time constraint. Please forgive me. Okay. Fairy beauty is marked both by its alluring and perilous excesses. We have all read tales of how the fair folk lured unsuspecting mortals to their deaths or eternal servitude effortlessly for nothing more than to satisfy a whim. How men sacrificed a lot in their quest for glamoured gold that turned to withered leaves or dust in their hands, and of the cruel revelry of fairy, where it is not boredom but Dionysian rapture that causes death and damnation. We recall that creative damnation usually takes place through food, drink, dancing, and sex in fairy. These cruel and enthralling stories made us dance after death in the depths of our imagination. This understanding of the rather nebulous fair folk was shaken by Disney's bowdlerizing taint of usually black and white miniature fairies and fairy godmothers whose raison d'etre was merely to right some wrong in the protagonist's life. In On Fairy Stories, Tolkien scorns and denounces the general shallow perception of fairy stories. He says that they are usually about fairies or elves, an unreal or incredible story or a falsehood, saying that fairy is in reality much more than that. It cannot be described, only felt. It is unadulterated magic. It contains all kinds of fantastical creatures, but is much more than them. It is feverish prisons of fear and rapture coursing through your body and the very air. It is everything. In our world of found out things, the popular idea of the Fae has devolved into little more than a plot device in a fairy tale, or an exquisitely beautiful being, usually a woman with great magical powers that are usually used for the benefit of mankind. However, we see a return to the older, darker notion of fairy and the romanticizing of the older notion in contemporary TV series and YA novels like Holly Black's The Darkest Part of the Forest and Cassandra Clare's The Dark Artifices. Texts like these become fodder for the creation or derivation of fanfiction. Fanfiction doesn't only romanticize the monstrosity of fairies, it also celebrates it. While fanfiction reading and writing isn't restricted to any particular age group, popular opinion often associates them with teenage girls, some of the primary consumers of YA. In fanfiction, we see both the reclamation of the cruel, amoral, and taking fairy, and the reappearance of the delicate, diminutive creatures of Disney and the Victorian age. My presentation would deliberate on teen wolf fanfiction with more sexual content due to the immenseness of the corpus of fanfiction and the time constraints. It is rather interesting that Teen Wolf, a show based on werewolves, turns to other fantastical beings to discuss rape and mind and body manipulation. Fanfiction, a form of art generally despised as the lowest of low art, escapes the censure and censorship of most other forms of art. The ubiquity and anonymity of the internet leads to a raw kind of honesty, enabling fanfiction writers to speak the dialect of the century and to dabble in their deepest, darkest, and most disturbing thoughts and ideas without the fear of discovery. Writers use the fairy AU, or alternate universe, of Fae characters to explore hierarchies in fairyland, the changing and corrupting nature of power and sex, how careless bargains lead to creative damnation, and to experiment on specific kinks in fairy pornography. In the static fanfic Salt in a Waltz, the Bayrak Khalid experiments with an almost Alice in Wonderland-ish size kink that's enabled by Styles' Fae magic. In the bluntly gleeful author's note, the author declares that the fanfic is genuinely nothing more than a fairy Styles PWP, which stands for Porn Without Plot. Often, in fairy fanfiction, the faeness of a character becomes little more than a porn device. In some fanfiction, writers often turn TV show or book characters of the fantasy genre into Fae. The aloofness, agelessness, and casual cruelty of the Fae enhance the innate amorality or psychopathology of the characters and their complexity. In the Teen Wolf fandom, for instance, the more morally grey Styles would usually be written as the Fae character in a Sterek, which is Styles and Derek pairing. In a Steo, Styles and Theo pairing, or Steter, Styles and Peter pairing, however, Theo and Peter become Fae instead. Both have very questionable morality, have a silver tongue that causes chaos and confusion, and are antagonists in the series. Some fics leads to Styles becoming a Fae as the story takes its course. In The Binding of the Fairies 4 Spells, Frederica Bain talks about the curious similarity of fairies to demons and how the one is often conflated with the other. Ancient spells that called upon fairies and demons used intriguingly similar terminology and words laced with propitiation, fear, and fascination all at once. King James's demonology poses that fairies are illusions of demons. In Folger Shakespeare Library MSVB 2615, a compendium of spells and charms from around 1577 to 83, Oberon, though he is referred to as the king of the fairies, was listed as a spirit along with Baal and Satan. Sex becomes a very important binding element in fairy and demon lore, in fanfiction and otherwise. Sex is enfolded into a larger narrative of capture or seduction and abduction to fairyland for purposes that may also include companionship, practical services, desire for children, and the need to pray a human tithe to hell. The intensely pleasurable nature of fairy sex and how pliant and willing it renders the human raises several very interesting questions regarding consent. Such fics are sometimes tagged dubcon or dubious consent, despite the clear lack of any consent and the manipulation of the mind and the body. In his Obsession by Alpha Raiken, Theo Raiken, a dark fairy baits styles using hallucinations and the very eerie air of the forest into stepping into his personally constructed fairy ring meant for a binding flame that would make the victim his thrall. Styles' oblivious entry into the ring creates a maddening lust in him and incapacitates him from resisting Theo's raid. Theo offers Styles a drink, crooning, "Shh, you must be thirsty, all of that walking, all of that mourning, you must be dying of thirst." The rape, the drink Theo offers Styles after, and Theo's branding of Styles, consummates Theo's ownership of Styles and the beginning of Styles' conversion to a trickster spirit himself. In this fanfiction, we see everything through Theo's perspective. Theo smugly thinks that fairyship would help Styles reach self-actualization, to be the trickster spirit that Theo knew Styles had been born to be, and that together they could lure wayward beings into this very clearing for fun, for sacrifice, for solstice celebrations, for no other reason than that they wanted to. Unlike in other mediums where fairies are considered completely other, even for a fantastical creature, unlike the werewolf and the vampire who at least share an expired or hybrid humanness, fanfiction writers play with the idea of converting a human to a fae and vice versa. His Obsession also features light fairies, who are rather reminiscent of the diminutive fairies Tolkien derides. These fairies do not contribute anything to the plot, they merely flit around in the background, consumed by horror at Styles' violation and Theo's malevolence. By the way, this fic is tagged dubcon, with a major warning tag being creator chose to ignore archive warnings, implying that the writer understands that there's nothing dubious about the lack of consent here. Slash male content, yaoi content, is often characterized by an alarming level of casual, even romanticized sexual violence, and fanfiction is no different. In his analysis of the medieval-themed porn movie Hard as Marble, which features a sex triangle between a wizard, a knight, and a squire, in gay internet medievalism, erotic story archives, the Middle Ages, and contemporary gay identity, Stephen F. Kruger notes that images of sword and sorcery, two things that are intimately connected with the world of the fae, proliferate in gay erotica and fantasies, and that the allure of Hard as Marble lies in the intricate connections of power relations with sex. The susceptibility of the protagonist's masculinity to being controlled, his being lured despite himself into the pleasures of gay sex, and his forced submission. We see several instances of such forced submission in fairy/fanfiction, where the pleasure seems to override or justify the rapey nature of intercourse. Cracklepop's Charmed by Thy Beauty tells a similar tale of violence and mind-breaking pleasure. It puts a little spin on the fairy tale Rapunzel and is a diabolical inversion of the biblical story of Samuel. Styles' mother Claudia strikes a bargain with the fairy king, Peter Hale, where the moniker is just one of several he uses. In her desperation to conceive her child, she promises her newborn to him. She tries to hide her child and his name from the king, alas, in vain. Peter quotes Styles, who is oblivious to the deal made by his mother, and Beetle forces his name out of him after feeding him with fairy fruit. It is the juice of the same fruit that Peter uses to lubricate Styles before raping him, drawing on the ever-present connection.
I'm going to have to give you just 2 more minutes, Cynthia, if that's okay.
Yeah. Yes, I'm almost done, Dr. Will. Yes. It is a juice of the same fruit that Peter uses to lubricate Styles before raping him, drawing on the ever-present connection between food, nature, and sex. Charmed by Thy Beauty stresses on the innate importance of one's true name and uses name power as a pornographic device. In his feeble attempt to help Styles, Deaton tells Styles, every one of us, no matter how uncanny, is answerable to a true name, implying that he would be free of his servitude if he learned the Fairy King's real name. Styles tries to dredge his hazy memories to claw his way out of his bondage, but the fic hangs in the air with him succumbing to the king calling his name again. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Sorry to have to rush you there. I'm going to, we're already into lunch hour, so if I keep it to 5 minutes question time, is that all right? That's great, Cynthia, thanks. We've got a lot of kind of discussion here. I'm trying to find a particular question. Okay, from Brian Brown to Anna, who gets to choose? Who gets to choose to be Fae in LARP? How do you and why do you choose to be Fae? Is there a connection to Carnival in the upending or playing out roles you don't or aren't able to in everyday life? And also, to put, there's a lot of things going on here. Also, to push Carnival further, are there times in LARP where the Fae hierarchy is upended?
So just keeping it very brief, yes, I didn't have time to get into this in the presentation, but non-player characters are written by the games masters. They still have a degree of agency. Usually the games master will create a world and then populate it with stock personalities that occupy key positions for players to interact with. And then those positions will be given to a volunteer, and the volunteer will read their brief and run with it. So there's a kind of negotiation of how much of yourself you want to bring into the role. On how and why do you choose to be Fae, a lot of plot lines will involve Fae characters, and that will be the main way that Fae NPCs can happen. Or if it's some general allusions to folklore are really popular as well. So you do have werewolves and vampires and undead as well. Is there a connection between Carnival and the upending of social roles? Absolutely, in the UK. So there are systems elsewhere in Scandinavia and especially in Russia where what character you can play is dependent on how you physically look as a player. So women are often not allowed on battlefields. If you are above a certain height, you're say not allowed to play a dwarf, which is problematic in its own ways. But in the UK, there's a lot of freedom to explore different gender identities, different fantastical creatures, different styles of role play. So yes, absolutely, there's that subversion there. And is there times where in love where Fae hierarchy is appended? Yes, definitely. There is a Fae character in Curious Pastimes, the system that I play, which is the exception to every rule. She is able to lie. She is very warm and caring and compassionate, but she is the exception that also proves the rule because she's there for a reason. And it's a conscious decision on behalf of the playing team.
Thanks, Anna. I've got a question for Gavin here. Gavin, do you think there's a, who's it from? From AK Fortner. Gavin, do you think there's an element of fairy allowing Japanese creators to be almost embody kami in a way that wasn't available before the introduction of Western literary traditions? And can you explain what kami is? Because
yeah, so I mean, Faulkner might have a different definition, but my understanding is that kami are sort of Shinto like spirits, like deities. I guess what could be conflated with fairies. I mean, to the extent of the paper, I was looking purely at the fairy as like a product of textual transmission. I think the kami were already being articulated in art and literature prior to their kind of transmission into Japan in the late 19th century. It's not to say that retroactively they couldn't, but definitely when you see fairies, or they're called yosei, is the Japanese term in contemporary media. There's this kind of syncretism between what we conceive as the European or the Germanic fairy with elements of kind of native Japanese mythology, folklore. So I suppose, yeah.
I'm going to have to ask one last question. I don't think, unless there's another one coming up. Yeah, I'm just going to ask a question to all of you, really, but primarily to Cynthia, first of all. But Cynthia, you were talking a lot about the pleasures and sometimes illicit pleasures of like fairy fan fiction. And we notice from other talks like fairy itself is kind of a realm of pleasure and often quite transgressive pleasure. So, but I'm wondering what brings you three together is this very distinctive thing. Is you're not just like responding to a text that other people have created for you. In all three media that you're talking about, fan fiction, LARP, and the video games, these are kind of like interactive. So what I'm trying to get at here is there some kind of extra dimension to the pleasure you get in writing fan fiction? So, something like the self-creativity that's involved there, that's aligned particularly with fairy pleasure. And then that's to Cynthia first, but to all three of you really. Does it make sense, that question? I'm not quite sure what I was saying.
Yeah.
So Cynthia.
Yes. Okay. So I think I write fan fiction, and several of my friends write fan fiction. And from what I saw in the comments, some of us here also write fan fiction. And I feel that it's a shared joke with those who write fan fiction, that there's a lot of projection happening. Maybe more so than in other mediums. Some people might not agree with me, but it is a shared joke of sorts. I don't quite know why this is, but I feel that, and you see this in several authors' notes, you see that they bring all of their issues, they bring their personal problems, they bring everything to fan fiction. And I think when it comes to fan fiction, people always write it with a certain aim in mind. And a lot of the time, that aim, both for the readers and the writers, is pleasure, especially when it comes to certain kinds of AUs, especially when we are talking about fairy AUs, I think, because when it comes to the fairy, there are certain things. Anybody who reads hentai would, I think, be a little familiar with this. There is a lot that you can do by adding magic to the mix. There is a lot of extra kink that you can bring inside, and I feel that that's something that fairy allows you on a very, very surface level. The first fanfic that I talked about, I think I mentioned it in passing in just around 2 lines or so. When I talked about size kink, it's actually quite a long fanfic, just about size kink, mostly about size kink. But you see that there are several fanfics like this that use fairy more as a prop than anything else for kink. And then you have several other fanfics who delve into the power mechanisms. And as Dr. Kaja mentioned in the comments, when you deal with these fantasies, a part of you knows that you would be horrified if you read this or wrote it. But since it's a fantasy, you allow yourself to indulge in it. And I feel that fairy kind of gives that extra depth to it somehow. The kind of fairy that Tolkien talks about, at least. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. So, did either of you two want to speak, Gavin and Anna?
I can speak forever, but Anna, do you want to maybe go first?
Yeah, I could also speak forever. I'm just trying to hectically answer Twitter questions as well. I think that the whole process of shared fantasy creation in LARP has something very fairish about it. It's very fluid, very subversive, and with earlier papers mentioning whether fairies are like a separate type of entities or whether they are a state of being that anybody can attain, I feel LARP functions in a similar way, where you enter this world and you become your character who is very real and experiences very real emotions, but is somehow also inexplicably connected to you, the person. And where does the character go when you leave the playing field?
Yeah, it's the old magic circle metaphor that Hausinger brings up. You know, the idea of a circumscribed space of play with rules that are somehow exempt from reality. That's why virtual reality fascinated me. You know, actually having a VR headset, and of course, rather conveniently, it's a game about fairies, which I don't think is coincidence. I think there is obviously a kind of thematic congruence there. Absolutely. Like, obviously speaking self-servingly for games, or even with role-playing games, like, I feel like that presents a really rich and diverse sphere, a cross-cultural one in the case of like Japanese games as well, for fairies to flourish. And they could act as a good bridge, I think, for kind of the literature that is in Japan, but obviously there's a language barrier.
Right, yeah. Okay, well, I think I'll have to end that there and then let us all go to lunch. So we'll see you whenever it is. But I don't know if there's going to be an extension after this, but yeah, after lunch. So at 1:30, we'll be back here. But thanks, all three of you. There's a brilliant paper. Hello, everybody. Are we all back and ready for the plenary? Right. I'm going to introduce Sam George. Now, Dr. Sam George, as you probably know, is the co-founder of the Open Grays Open Minds project. And Sam is Associate Professor in Research at the University of Hertfordshire and the convener of the Open Grays Open Minds project. She's published widely on botany, vampires, werewolves, wolf children, yokai and shadows. Her recent publications included the co-edited collection In the Company of Wolves, and a Wolves and Wildness special issue of Gothic Studies, co-edited with myself in 2019. In 2021, Sam's published articles on the Black Vampire, Vampires, Demons and Disappearing Shadows for Gothic Studies, and a piece on Japanese mermaids for a Corona Gothic special issue of Critical Quarterly. She's currently leading an impact case study on ethical Gothic, researching a book on fairies for the Bloomsbury Monsters and Marvel series, and co-editing with myself again a book on John Polidori's Vampire and its legacy. Her latest monograph, In the Kingdom of Shadows, Optics, Dark Folklore and the Gothic in the Literature of the Long 19th Century, is forthcoming for 2022. So I'll just let Sam begin with the talk.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, excuse me, I'm just going to share my slides to begin with. Try again. There we go. Just going to get these to full view. There we go. Can everyone see these okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So the title of my talk is Fairy Lepidoptera, The Dark History of Butterfly Winged Fairy. To begin with, I'm just going to raise a few research questions that I had in mind when I first started thinking about fairies. I was particularly interested in where fairies belonged in relation to the Gothic, but there was also one or two other questions that I was keen to research. So I was thinking about, when did we lose our fear of fairies? I mean, this is something that Diane Purkis grappled with when she first wrote her book, Troublesome Things, in 2000. I was also interested in how they came to be associated with the dead. Obviously, as a Gothic scholar, this was particularly intriguing for me. And thirdly, I was interested in how they came to get their butterfly wings. Are fairies immortal, or can they fade and die? These were all really puzzling questions to me when I first started thinking about fairies. And I was also very keen to try to make connections, what were the connections between these things? And also what was the legacy of these ideas in the present? So how are fairies situated in the Gothic was something that was really preoccupying me. So this presentation is very much a kind of visual record of where my research journey has led me in my attempt to answer some of these questions, and also to make connections between them. So I'm going to begin with the idea of fairies as nature spirits. This enchanted pixie tree in Cheshire is suggestive of the old saying, fairy folk are in old oaks. And today fairies are increasingly viewed as benevolent nature spirits, a consolation for modernity or the loss of wild environments. But this has not always been the case. Fairy Minister Robert Kirk, explained that fairies are the dead, or alternatively, are of a middle nature betwixt man and angel, as demons were thought to be of old. Obviously, this mention of demons really kind of fired my imagination. The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns and Fairies, which dates back to 1682, but wasn't actually published until 1815, also claims that we each have a fairy counterpart haunting us like a shadow. So again, I was really fascinated by this idea of a kind of shadow world, and certainly the idea that we have a fairy counterpart who's constantly haunting us. But I want to start off my strand in relation to where did fairies get their butterfly wings, and try to tease out the connections between this and fairies as the dead. Thomas Stottart's 1798 illustrations to The Rape of the Lock are reputedly the first to give fairies butterfly wings, and there are a number of sources that verify this. These 18th century images appear to be derived from putty or kind of winged infants, and Stottard followed his textual source and placed his insect-winged sprites halfway between angels, disembodied, and fairies, embodied. And amazingly, this is the first time that fairies are described as winged beings. Pope calls them elemental sylphs. And there's a little quote here: "Sun to the sun their insect wings unfold, waft on the breeze or sink in clouds of gold," from Canto 2 of The Rape of the Lock. So some of you are probably thinking, well, surely, you know, something like Nymphidia would also reference butterfly wings. So I started looking into this. Drayton's poem Nymphidia from 1627. And interestingly, it's Queen Mab's chariot, which is winged, and it's based on Mercutio's Queen Mab speech from Romeo and Juliet. And Mercutio describes Mab as delicate as an insect, appearing at night to inspire human dreams. However, it's her carriage that is winged and not actually Mab herself. So there's a little extract here, I'm not going to read it all out, but you can see how the seat is made of the soft wool of the bee, the wings of the pied butterfly, etc. But the fact that Mab herself is not winged is actually overlooked in this wonderful painting, The Court of Fairy from 1906. And this is very much a kind of Gothicized version of the poem by Hector Thomas Maybank Webb. And it's illustrating this kind of burlesque aspect of the poem Nymphidia. And here Mab has butterfly wings and her carriage is also insect drawn. It's a really wonderful painting. So I carried on exploring the development of this visual imagery, the idea that fairies have butterfly wings. And I was struck by Joseph Noel Paton's The Pursuit of Pleasure, A Vision of Human Life, 1885. And in this, the daughter of Cupid and Psyche is represented as a fairy with butterfly wings. And she's tantalizingly visible and yet just out of reach. So I started to think about myth in relation to this as well. And this naked butterfly figure is very reminiscent, in the previous painting, it's very reminiscent of earlier images around the marriage of Cupid and Psyche, in particular by John Gibson in 1844. And this fairy image is repeated in later works such as Klimt's Pan Consoling Psyche. And what we have here really is a kind of representation of the fact the ancient Greek word for butterfly is psyche, which means soul. And so we immediately have a connection between the butterfly wings, the idea of the soul, and hopefully, as I'll later show, the idea of fairies as the dead. So there is a leap here into fairies as the spirits of the dead. Such depictions of butterfly-winged fae provide a link to fairies as spirits of the dead for me. The butterfly is the mythical shape assumed by the soul in sleep or following death. And there's actually a connection to vampire lore here as well in mythology. In Slavic lore, the soul assumes the shape of a butterfly or moth when it leaves the body. And the souls of vampires are thought to be incarnated in death's head moths. You can see the moth with a kind of skull image on its back here, which is incredibly gothic. If such a moth is captured, according to this mythology, and impaled, the vampire will be unable to travel. So Fairy Lepidoptera is in some ways allied to undead creatures such as vampires. And interestingly, someone like Fuseli can really bring out these Gothic connections. His Gothic vision of a Midsummer Night's Dream, Titania and Bottom, which is sort of circa 1790, is full of menace, shown in his malevolent moth-headed fairies, including this rather wonderful fairy child with a proboscis or kind of butterfly tongue. So I was really kind of fascinated by this image when I was looking at the painting. And this takes me to fairies in relation to other insects. So I call this fairies behaving badly. In 1845, Halliwell Phillips, the literary folklorist, devoted an entire volume to illustrations of the fairy mythology in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And surprisingly, Shakespeare's fairies appear to have no affinity with the insects they resemble. And in contrast to benevolent nature spirits, they're depicted indulging in wanton acts of cruelty, particularly towards insects. So armed fairies war with rare mice, bats, for their leathern wings. They kill caterpillars as canker and spear a red-hipped humblebee. And it's these darker, more menacing scenes that Arthur Rackham chooses to illustrate in his version of A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1908. And this sort of leads me on to why we need protection against fairies. Again, this is something that Diane Perkis spoke about so wonderfully on day one. Fairies are often presented as demonic or a kind of undead force within folklore, one which humans need to seek protection against. As Catherine Briggs has noted, people walking alone at night, especially through fairy-haunted places, had many ways of protecting themselves. The first might be by sacred symbols, by making the sign of a cross, or by carrying a cross, particularly one made of iron, by prayers, or the chanting of hymns, by holy water sprinkled or carried, or by carrying and strewing churchyard mould in their path. And again, there's an obvious connection here to the way that we deal with vampires in mythology. Bread and salt was also effective, and both were regarded as sacred symbols, one of life and the other of eternity. So for me, these superstitions are evidence of the fairies' associations with the churchyard and with graves, and it really does start to show their Gothic credentials. This wonderful image is Alan Lee, the fairy ring. And those of you that are up on your folklore in relation to fairy rings, the idea is that on entering the fairy ring, you may be made invisible, but you'll also be made to dance until you die of exhaustion. So again, a very menacing image of fairies. Yeah, so this leads me on to the wonderful concept of vampiric fairies. You can see the fairies are getting more and more Gothic as we go through. And one thing that fascinated me here was a story by Yeats, The Land of Heart's Desire, a play, sorry, by Yeats, The Land of Heart's Desire. And Yeats had apparently been reading about vampires in Joseph Ennemose's History of Magic of 1852. And in Yeats's play, there's a vampiric fairy child who's invited over the threshold of a Sligo cottage and sees a crucifix and immediately shrieks and covers her eyes. And again, a real kind of overlap between the fairy and the vampire. And you don't have to look too hard to find Celtic examples of vampiric fairies. So we've got the vampiric Scottish fairies who dance with and exhaust their male victims and then tear them to pieces with their sharp fingernails. And they have hooves instead of feet. And like many fae, of course, they can be killed with iron. And then we've got the Irish vampiric fairies, or red bloodsuckers, thought to be influential on Le Fanu's female vampire Carmilla of 1871. And I think this for me, again, was a bit of a eureka moment because I started to immediately be able to make connections between the two beings. And ancient fairies also, according to folklore, have dried out bodies that constantly need fresh blood. And this links fairies to vengeful ancestors of the dead. In fact, there's an old Highland legend that claims that you must bring water into the house at night, so fairies don't quench their thirst with your blood. And again, this is something that Diane Perkis wrote about in her wonderful book, Troublesome Things, in 2000. And this moves me on to more graveyard images of fairies. So this graveyard is a 19th century image of fairies. And Fairies Encircle a Tomb at Night in The Visit at Moonlight by E.T. Paris. This is 1832. And this painting was particularly pertinent for me on my research journey because the connection is made here between romantic ballet and fairy art. It's made very clear in the white floating figure of the fairy ballerina in productions of Giselle and Ondine. And it's here transposed, as you can see, into this painting. And there's also a very strong association with fairies and spirits of the dead that I think can be found in this rather wonderful piece of art. So this leads me on to fairy funerals, and there's kind of an obsession really with the idea of fairy funerals, but also this big question mark about whether fairies are immortal, or do fairies fade and die, or are they actually immortal? Thomas Crofton Croker was fascinated by funerals and fairies, and he revived the tradition of keening or wailing for the dead. And his important fairy work, Fairy Legends, was published in 1825 to begin with. And of course, William Blake popularised, well, has done in later years, but he famously witnessed a fairy funeral and he wrote an account of it. And he saw creatures of the size and colour of green and grey grasshoppers bearing a body laid out on a rose leaf, which they buried with songs and then disappeared. So obviously this interested me because it's got the insect link as well. But it does also suggest that fairies do die and that they do resemble insects. And the painting you can see on here is The Fairy's Funeral by John Anster Fitzgerald, 1864. And this struck me because the fairy death scene is evoked with such kind of fragile melancholy and wonder. Other accounts for those that are interested, Bowker's Fairy Funeral in Goblin Tales of Old Lancashire in 1883, and the funeral of a fairy queen actually is documented in Hunt's Popular Romances of the West of England in 1865. So this is all leading to the idea, not only the association with graveyards, but Lady Wilde's wonderful idea that fairies are actually the fallen. So Lady Wilde published Legends, Charms and Superstitions of Ireland in 1887. And in this work, she claimed that all the Irish believe that the fairies are the fallen angels who were cast down by the Lord God out of heaven for their sinful pride. And some fell into the sea, and some fell on dry land, and some fell deep down into hell. And the devil gives to these knowledge and power, and sends them on earth where they work much evil. So again, a rather demonic image of fairies as the fallen. This is wonderfully Gothic, of course, which is why I was so interested in it. So what we're getting here then are lots of images of fairies manifesting as insects, but also manifesting as the dead. And my research was to try to find the connection between these things. And W.Y. Evans Wentz recorded the Highland belief in fairy hosts as the evil dead, and Cornish Peskies as the souls of unbaptized babies. This is something we were hearing about on day one in that wonderful paper about fairies being the souls of unbaptized children. So Evans Wentz also has this idea, but the interesting thing for me is not only does he say Cornish Peskies are the souls of unbaptized babies, but he says that they appear at twilight in the form of moths. So again, we've got this wonderful connection between fairies as the spirits of the dead or as unbaptized babies, that relationship to souls again, but also this idea that they're somehow insects. So I've got a wonderful picture of a white plume moth here, and you can see its kind of feathery, wonderful feathery wings, which are a little bit fairy-like as well. And the other image is Perner's Funeral Fairies from 1888. And this takes me to the Cottony Fairies, which we were hearing about this morning. And again, the Cottony Fairies are something of a eureka moment in relation to this research. So these spiritual and entomological ideas that I've been talking about peak in the aftermath of the publication of the Cottony Fairy photographs in 1920. Obviously, these fairies have butterfly wings and they're such iconic images. but I want to delve a little bit deeper and see if I can make that association with the dead. So we heard this morning that about the two girls, Frances Griffiths 10 and 16-year-old Elsie Wright, photographed what they called the Beck Fairies in 1917 using Arthur Wright's camera, leading many, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, to an unshakable and uncanny belief in the spirit world. And this is what Merrick's paper was on this morning. And Conan Doyle was so steadfast in his belief in the Cottingley Fairies that he even interpreted the point of a pin on this gnome's midriff in the photo of Francis as the creature's umbilicus, proving that fairies can be born. So again, this was something that I was particularly interested in at the beginning. And it's a debate that rages on, really. Are fairies born? They do seem to have midwives. Are they immortal, or can they fade and die? Yeah, so this photograph is also very important for me. So there was some chat earlier on about, you know, where did the girls get the images from? And apparently it's from Princess Mary's gift book of 1914. I do actually have a copy of this now myself. They made cutouts of these fairies and secured them with hat pins and then photographed them back in the Beck. So it's easy to see the influence on the Cottingley fairy photographs when you look at these images of butterfly-winged fairies again, befriending young girls. I must check the illustrator of this actually, because I do have a copy of it. But you can see here anyway, those images and the way that the girls kind of were, the way the girls responded to those. And this kind of led me to the idea of, led me back to the idea of shadow worlds, because of this idea of cutouts, that the fairies are very one-dimensional. And I thought it was very interesting that fairies are said to reside in a shadow world. And in 1918, Lotte Reiniger's uncanny filmmaking process involved the art of paper cutting and silhouette puppetry, only 1 year after Francis and Elsie used cutouts and Arthur Wright's camera to create the Beck Fairies. And in doing this, Reiniger, not only did she seem to respond to Robert Kirk's idea that fairies belong to a shadow world, that in fact we all have fairy counterparts in that shadow world, but she cemented a link between fairy tale cinema and the land of shadows forever in creating these images. And this leads me on to fairies again as souls of the dead. And this is in response to the Cottingley fairy photographs and where we are now within this Victorian period, moving into Edwardian period, I should say. Fascinated by angels, ghosts and vampires, Victorians and then Edwardians saw fairies as the souls of the dead. In an age of widespread religious doubt, thought turned to the persistence of the dead and to occult methods of communicating with them. And rather than dispelling fairies, memories of the dead in World War I heightened a belief in airy spirits and spirit photography. This image is from Julia Margaret Cameron. So again, we were hearing a little bit about this from Merrick's paper this morning. So we're very much back with the idea of fairies as spirits of the dead and the connection between them. And I want to mention the theosophic views of fairies. It was in this climate that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's defence of the Cottingley fairies emerged. The coming of the fairies in 1922 was influenced by theosophical views of fairies as evidence of a shadowy spirit world. Dell-dwelling and butterfly-winged, the Cottingley fairies were important too because they seemingly confirmed that fairies were of the Lepidoptera or butterfly order, an idea that became an established part of theosophical thought. So again, this was something of a eureka moment for me in my research, looking through these notes and thinking about Conan Doyle's work, because I found this wonderful quote. And this is Conan Doyle explaining the theosophic view of fairies from his notes, which came from E.L. Gardner in The Coming of the Fairies. And it says here, fairies are not born and do not die as we do, though they have their periods of outer activity and retirement. Allied to the Lepidoptera or butterfly genus of our familiar acquaintance, rather than the mammalian line, they partake of certain characteristics that are obvious. So again, we have like the firm understanding here that fairies are actually allied to the Lepidoptera or butterfly genus. And I started to think about what the legacy of this was in the present. This was where my research was kind of leading to. And there are some really wonderful artists who have kind of, in some ways, also been inspired by this idea. This early theory endures in contemporary manifestations, such as the work of this Amsterdam-based artist. And he uses found bug carcasses, butterfly wings, and beetle husks to make tiny fairy sculptures inspired by Memento Mori. So there's still that link to the dead and still that wonderful kind of creative element in thinking about fairies as insects and Lepidoptera. And I think Pan's Labyrinth needs to get referenced here as well. This is obviously a much more humorous take on this. And it shows a butterfly staring at its kind of mirror image, which is a shadowy fairy in a book. So again, you get that same connection between the butterfly and the fairy, but done with kind of some humour in quite a knowing way in Pan's Labyrinth. And this takes me on to Carnival Row. Here, the fairies' insect wings and delicate beauty mask their dark history as fallen and endangered descendants of the Thloidae Dunun. I do apologise to any Irish people for my pronunciation of that. And this takes us back to Lady Wilde's accounts. So I think things like Carnival Row really do show the legacy of all the ideas that I've been talking about. And also steampunk. I think steampunk has a place here in relation to fairies in the Gothic, and also the legacy of the ideas that I've been talking about. Steampunk fairies are also very much part of this legacy for me. The miniature clock pot fairy in this image, and these tiny steampunk fairy wings still referencing the butterfly, show how steampunk can creatively subvert history and present an alternative future imagined from a Victorian perspective. And again, I want to return to this idea of, the Cottingley Fairy hoax, as it's been called. And again, Merrick mentioned this, but in the 1980s, over 60 years after the first fairy photographs, Francis and Elsie confessed to using cutouts, but insisted that they had actually seen fairies in the beck or glen. And in fact, Frances went to her death maintaining that this image was entirely genuine. So this still intrigues me. I always wonder why this image in particular was claimed to be genuine. So we're in a very dark place in relation to fairyland. We're very much in a dark fairyland, which shows a very strong relationship to the Gothic. At first sight, the received idea of fairyland seems as far as possible from the shadowy realms of the dead. And yet, as my research journey has shown, it's possible to be haunted and teased by resemblances between them. And this is something that Catherine Briggs had spoken about as well. As a Gothic scholar open to the darkness of fairyland, I'm no longer surprised by the presence of a fairy ring in a graveyard, or by the monuments to the dead at Highgate Cemetery actually starting to resemble fairies. And to conclude, the representations of fairies shift from disembodied angels to manifestations as insectile Lepidoptera and shadowy spirits of the dead. In tracing this complex history, we can better understand fairies in the present. Surprisingly, there's never been an issue of Gothic studies on fairies. It's clear from this conference that fairies should be more prominent and they do have a part to play within the future of Gothic. And as our conference image, fairies looking through a Gothic arch, playfully suggests. At night, a small troop of fairies have arrived at a Gothic ruin. Through the arch, a light shines. One carries a wreath and a chain of flowers. It's a haunting depiction of the Fae indulging in some Gothic tourism. And looking at this image in the 21st century, we can at last acknowledge that we are living in Gothic times, and that the concept of the Gothic has and always had has had an association with the fairy from its very inception. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. That's a wonderful sort of exploration of the crossover between taxonomy of insects and Gothic fairies, and a brilliant defence of the idea of the recuperation of fairy literature and fairy fiction for the Gothic, which is what the theme of the conference is. So I just opened it up to questions now. I've noticed in the chat there's been lots and lots of people free associating and finding all these links with butterfly imagery and fairy funeral imagery in other texts. So, for instance, like Carmilla, there's a moth figure appears in Carmilla, which I'd forgotten about, and there's a fairy funeral in George MacDonald's fantasies, and lots of other associations. So just see if there's any questions here. Everybody loves it, I think, which is great. Dalen's asking, did the Banshee inspire the idea of Willis from the ballet Gazelle, since they both dance men to death? And he also asks, who created again that fairy funeral picture? Did you say Pernice?
Oh, there are two, yeah. So I had two on there. One was the Fairy Fitzgerald, and the other one was, yeah, Pernice, I think, Pernice. They're from 1888, I think. I'll have to have a look again. Yeah, there are two fairy funeral pictures, which are really gorgeous. And do show that link to funerals, etc. I think the idea of dancing to death is very prominent within fairy folklore. So I wouldn't kind of say one thing inspired another, because it's just so prevalent anyway. I mean, thinking about the idea of fairy rings again, it's very prominent there. You know, there's always been this association that somehow if you enter a fairy ring, you're going to get danced to death. So yeah, it's very, very, very prominent imagery. It may be from the fairy ballads, it might be influenced by those, yeah.
Morgan Down was asking, do you have a source on the Scottish Banshee using fingernails as a weapon?
Yes. What it is now, probably not entirely sure. But there are always references having these very long fingernails. Again, it's a little bit vampiric, which they're meant to tear their victims to pieces with. As well as kind of other things that are going on. So very, very dark image of the fairy. And of course, very Celtic images as well, both those vampiric fairies. Yeah. So I think probably in those texts that deal particularly with Irish fairy lore.
And because you've talked so much about the relationship between death and the fairies, which recurs a lot, obviously. Somebody, Femi is asking, is there any relation between fairies being depicted as insects and insects playing a role in decay after death or returning bodies to the natural world? They were in the eco-fairy session yesterday, and that set them off thinking.
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Bill.
Sorry. Is there any relation between fairies being depicted as insects and then insects playing a role in decay after death or returning bodies to the natural world?
I haven't really thought about that, actually. Can you say a little bit more about whose question was that?
That's from Femi Sabali.
Right. I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean. Can you just elaborate a little bit and then I can jump in?
Let's see if there's any.
We're just talking about the idea of decay, really, and
I think they were, you know, the link between death and decay.
Yeah.
Maggots.
What did Kaya say?
Maggots.
Maggots.
We don't need to go there.
Yeah. Dead bugs. There's been some controversy about some of those insect sculptures, actually, but they are found images, but obviously they are based around dead insects. So obviously they're still in some ways fixated with this idea, because that kind of art just keeps coming back and is incredibly popular. Yeah. Can
I ask a question about how it's another thing that seems to be cropping in a lot of the talks, I mean, including my own actually, but this sort of conflict between this kind of reconciliation between nature and technology, or modernity and the archaic, and you've got that with your crossover of like the very scientific, the kind of the trying to subsume the anarchic magic of fairies into scientific taxonomy, the way that Arthur Conan Doyle was doing, and the way your whole talk is talking about Lepidoptera and classifying them in that way. But also, I think the steampunk fairies is another instance of it. So have you anything to say about that kind of mix of science and magic, really, that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, those people that are au fait with Victorian period and inter-Edwardian period will be aware of that kind of crossover. I know that Merrick's book is kind of looking at that as well. From my point of view, I mean, I don't think they're kind of closed down each other. I think they can sort of coexist in really interesting ways, as was shown in the theosophical view of fairies, and also Conan Doyle's kind of understanding of that. So yeah, on the one hand, we might have some kind of nod to taxonomy that's kind of throwback, possibly from the Enlightenment period. And also, but then a real sense in magic, a belief in spiritualism, in the spirit worlds, a kind of real focus on the supernatural. So it's just really fascinating to see the, the fusion of those ideas. And when I look at those fairy winged, those butterfly winged fairies, I really kind of see the connections there. And from my own point of view, I think I actually started off in very much within the world of science and literature, beginning with botany and kind of then coming to the Gothic out of that kind of area, that kind of field of research. And so I had actually started to look at entomology and the way it was very feminized during the Enlightenment period. This may not seem relevant, but it was kind of all part of my research journey in a way. And there were a lot of breeders of rare moths. There was kind of lots of wonderfully illustrated books on English Lepidoptera. And yes, those books weren't really open to the kind of wonder and magic of those creatures. But they did serve to kind of popularise an interest in butterflies and moths. And they were always feminised. The whole kind of pursuit of insects was very kind of feminised, because I think it was something that took place in the hedgerow or garden or field rather than in the laboratory. So it became kind of very feminine pursuit. And I kind of see the relationship of all these things when I look at those fairy images. But there's something wonderful about the way in which these come together, particularly with the Cottingley fairies and the kind of creative endeavours of those very young girls.
We've had a lot of people making, again, exploring these links between death and butterflies and so on. So Madeline's pointing out, in Irish mythology, butterflies represent the souls of the dead waiting to cross over into purgatory. I'm not sure if there's a Greek influence there, because obviously the Greeks had a similar mythology. And Merrick's asking a question. He's saying, it's interesting that Elsie Wright copied the fairies from an existing illustration that didn't have wings, but she added them. So why do you think she did that?
Yeah, I think it's just a general, it's a kind of fairy tale image by this point of the fairies. And I think it really struck me. I had to actually look at the photographs again and think about, do they have butterfly wings? What is the kind of imagery there? Yeah, so I think obviously the book that they were using as well to kind of cut out the images from, if this is true, those images, the fairies do have very strong butterfly wings. But there's something wonderful about kind of impaling them onto hat pins as well. I've kind of thought about that. It's kind of like almost like an entomological kind of process. So yeah, it's just absolutely fascinating, everything about it. And but I think just going back to the idea of souls as well, obviously the idea of psyche and the idea of the soul as being a moth or butterfly is very kind of prominent in a lot of this imagery. And I think all winged creatures, it's kind of the soul's journey. It's that whole idea of memento mori, that the kind of winged skull as well, and you can make connections with the death's head moth, with all kinds of things. So all these kind of winged creatures ultimately become associated with the soul. I think the soul's passage. Yeah.
And related to that, Elinka is asking a question. Would you say that linking fairies to butterflies and insects, natural but still other, would have also been a way to try and reconcile the mystery and fear of death, taking a very theological or unknown or scary concept and linking it to something present but still strange?
Yeah, I haven't really thought of it in those terms, but you may be right. There may be something, although insects are still very othered, particularly moths. So I'm not sure how comforting that image is. But I certainly think that making the butterfly-wing fairies, the kind of ones that are represented there, say with the Cottingley fairies, are reassuring in some way, and also incredibly delicate and beautiful, and melancholy as well. So they kind of represent all these things.
And I think with what Merritt was saying as well, that context of World War One, where people desperately needed comforting, the idea of the pretty and sweet sort of winged fairies was sort of quite an aid to that reconciliation with death. And Eliza Webb is asking, any thoughts on Nephilim?
On
Nephilim, you know, the kind of offspring of angels with humans and that.
Yeah, there's certainly something that could be developed there. It's not something that's kind of found its way into my research journey yet, but what I'm doing at the conference is constantly writing things down and things that I can chase up. So it's a really nice thought, and certainly I think it's something that I can incorporate. Yeah, thank you for that.
I can't see any more questions. There's a lot of very interesting discussion going on in the chat here, so I don't know if you want to follow that up. Or if there's no more questions, do you want to go on to the next break, or are you?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll take some time to answer some of the questions in the chat in the next hour or so. But thank you so much for such a positive response and lots of interesting questions. I've really enjoyed this research journey, and I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation, and particularly the images, which are actually really stunning. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the talk.
Hi everyone, welcome to the next panel today. It is in room 1, and this is Fairies, the Class War and Otherness. So if you're expecting Seduced by Fae, Women and Sexuality, please head over to room 2. We have 3 speakers with us today: Catherine Greenwood, Tam Mools and Hannah Pike. Are you all here?
I am here, yes, hello.
Yes.
I'm here. Oh, great, lovely, lovely. So, first up, we have Catherine Greenwood. So if you'd like to pop your camera and unmute yourself if you can, please. Sorry.
Okay.
Hold on, I've just got...
How is my volume for you?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'm just going to read out and introduce you quickly, if that's okay. I've sorry. Sorry, bear with me. Got a lot of ghosts in the machine today, I'm afraid. Right, sorry, Catherine Greenwood is from the University of Sheffield. She is a Scottish-Canadian poet and is doing a PhD in creative writing, poetry and Gothic studies, currently working on a dissertation entitled Gothicizing, a Poetics of Displacement, Immigrants / Effects. For her MA thesis at the University of New Brunswick, she wrote a neo-Gothic adaptation of Matthew Lewis's novel The Monk. Her paper today is The Ballad of Isabel Gunn and the Demon Lover, the Economic Migrant and Enchantment as a Recruitment Strategy. So yes, take us away. Thank you.
Okay. And where is my... Okay, sorry, I'm just looking for my PowerPoint. Here we go. Great. Okay, so yes, the Ballad of Isabel Gunn as the Demon Lover, the Economic Migrant and Enchantment as a Recruitment Strategy. So this is the story of an Orkney woman who secured employment in Canada's fur trade disguised as a man. and it's depicted in Stephen Scobie's 1987 documentary poem, The Ballad of Isabel Gunn. The structure governing his ballad is the demon lover. Traditional ballads are rooted in folk and working class conditions and serve a didactic purpose, and this function is shared by the documentary poem. Scobie hybridizes form to create a narrative about a taxing frontier environment, and a central theme is labor. Labor as work, as childbirth, and as commodity. Isabel Gunn's life story readily lends itself to ballad form. Sparse records portray an Orcadian woman known as Mary Fubister, born around 1780. At 25, she's hired under the alias John Fubister and signs a 3-year contract with the Hudson's Bay Company to work in Rupert's Land, now Canada. Whether she was following a lover to Canada or was simply seeking well-paid work is unknown, but in summer 1806, she set sail for Labrador and spent 2 years working at anything and well, like the rest of the men. Near the end of her term, in both senses, while working in Canada's Northern Territories, John Fubister was outed when he gave birth. The baby boy was baptized John Scarth after his namesake, a longtime employee of the HBC who departed Orkney on the same voyage as Isabel. After returning to Orkney, she subsisted by knitting until her death at 81. So it looks like my screen is a little bit covered up here, but the quote from Charles Lowry says, "Other world itinerants must cross a water barrier, a river, or the ocean." In 1799, of the 530 men working for the HBC, Hudson's Bay Company, 416 of them were from Orkney, which prompted the Reverend Francis Liddell to write, "Instead of staying at home to cultivate their lands and protect their wives, children, parents, for the sum of £6 per annum, they hire themselves out for slaves in a savage land." This savage land in Scobie's ballad is figured as an otherworld northern hell, and the slaves as enchanted mortals. The 3-year terms undertaken by these migrant laborers, otherworld itinerants who are emptied rather than enriched by their indenture, reflect standard contractual language of the ballad tradition in describing periods of service, penance, and so on. Wondering if I can do something here. There. Oops. Sorry about that. Isabel, who leaves home as a beardless boy, has entered into such a contract. Charles Wimberley notes that balladry's preservation of a primitive belief that a person's spirit or power is bound up with their name provides the example Tam Lin, known as Jack or John, who's ensnared by elves when they give him his unearthly name. This is eerily akin to Isabel's entrance into a strange world when she steps onto the ship of her employer and assumes a new identity. The Demon Lover ballad is also known as James Harris, the Carpenter's Wife, etc. And the original broadside, variant A, in Francis Child's catalog, appeared in 1685, and the heading encapsulates the plot. A warning for married women, being an example of a woman who has plighted her troth to a seaman, was afterwards married to a carpenter, and at last carried away by a spirit. The supernatural nature of the revenant mariner varies, and variants E to G turn him into the devil. In Scobie's version, that horror is muted, yet Isabel is a knowing, metatextual interpreter of the legend she inhabits. Her secret first love makes her, quote, so happy, it scarcely mattered who he was, John Scarth. John Scarth is ideal HBC material. Reliable, solid, doer, one of those men not given over much to thinking, and who can wait out winter dull inside themselves like bear. Nonetheless, the tales he's told to woo her of a frigid Canadian winter and the 32 pounds a year he's paid to endure it inspire Isabel to sail away with him. Scarth's romance of Canada is akin to the demon lover tempting the woman by promising to show her lilies growing on the banks of Italy. Inducements include ships laden with gold and ventures to the far country. The far country in the ballad is synecdoche for all such enticements. On a map, James Bay hangs from the southern end of Hudson, an udder from a cow. Canada, in Isabel's pragmatic, homespun metaphor, is a resource to be milked. Evocative of the demon's beautiful to behold spell in which the mariner casts a glamour that shines like the brightest gold, Isabel's seducer himself succumbs to an enchantment. And, as in The Demon Lover, the estrangement between Scarth and Isabel begins after their departure, and Isabel attributes this to the fact that she's now become a man. But we'll learn that Scarth's abandonment is explained by the existence of a Chippewa Indian wife. Isabel's go-between, James Brown, reads her a Dear John, that is, John Fubister letter, in which Scarth tells Isabel his arms are filled with shadows. Scarth's reluctant ventriloquist, Brown, provides a blunt interpretation. He's had her now for 3 years. That's why he returned from Orkney. They had 2 children, boys, but both died young. The demon lover's betrayal here cuts both ways, and Scarth's country wife is a shadow seduction story. Isabel endures a season of hardship and heartbreak among black and sullen men, hibernating like animals in the grip of bitter cold, a hell where we huddled in furs, gathering round us the skin of our commerce, marten and fox, beaver and moose skin, small fortunes in London we wore on our backs. Scobie invents an affair between Isabel and a ship carpenter, and she conceptualizes her relationships with imagery of exchange. Her lover, David Spence, his surname an amalgam of spend and pence, is an emotional commodity hedged against Scarth's infidelity. Her intercourse with Scarth becomes a form of indentureship. Quote, we labored at making love like miners bound to a dangerous, ill-paid job. Scarth actually makes good on the promised gold, paying a fine void of emotional capital when Isabel gives birth to a son they both know isn't his. For his shame and mine, John Scarth laid down a purse of coins beside my bed and left. When the balladery's demon lover defaults on his bargain, he asks the woman, what, weep you for my gold, or do you weep for my fee? Fee is ambiguous, as the cost for the woman is leaving her son, but the ultimate tariff is her life when the ship sinks. This fee may be classed with other instances of tribute to the devil found in folklore. Scobie includes a document from the HBC account books that records a payment of £1 4 shilling from Isabel Gunn to her messenger, James Brown. For his service, the environment has exacted a toll, quote, 3 toes lost to the frostbite, that John Scarth throws into the East Main River. The gruesome offering foreshadows the drowning of Isabel's lover, David Spence, and the ship carpenter is the true tithe she pays, and it's also a tax on the HBC, just the cost of doing business. The most unheimlich moment in the Ballad of Isabel Gunn occurs when John Isabel, realizing he is pregnant, walks far into a barren waste of rock and muskeg. Here, in a no man's land outside the transient dwelling places of the fur traders, Isabel scrubs her face with earth, as if attempting to literally ground herself. It is in this unsettled state, and I use the term advisedly, she notices a ghostly indigenous family silently watching her. She cries out, Stromness, a place instead of a name. This strange utterance might be construed as an introduction, a statement of solidarity. She, like them, is indigenous to a space impacted by colonialism, or it is the magic word that releases her from an enchantment. With this place name, Isabel dispels her seducer's hold over her. The contest between us was over. Isabel is one of the revenant Nor'westers who returns from their otherworld ordeal, disenchanted, impoverished. Scobie's innovative iteration of the demon lover demonstrates how actors constrained by the economy of the ballad world are mirrored in colonial history, and how the didactic function of the ballad is borne out, with Isabel's story serving as a warning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. That was really interesting. I'm sure we'll enjoy your Q&A at the end of the other panelists. So next up we have Tam Mills with paper The Gothic Aristocracy, Fairies Class and the Power of Flight in Sylvia Townsend Warner's Kingdom of Elfin Tales. And Tam Mills has an MLit in Fantasy Literature from the University of Glasgow and a BA in Literature from Anglia Ruskin. Their research is currently focused on the work of Sylvia Townsend Warner, and they have previously presented papers at 2019's Fantastica and Fabled Coast conferences, as well as Glasgow GIFCon in 2018 and 19. Also have co-hosted a writing workshop at the LSFRC's Productive Futures Conference. So I'll invite you to put your camera on and share your screen, please.
Yeah, I think Catherine is still screen sharing.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I think it's
okay.
Sorted.
Can people hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Just a heads up that I'm going to be... no, hang on. Sorry, I was going to try and record it on my end, but I will not waste time fiddling around setting that up.
We are recording, and this will be sent to you.
Just get my slides then. Sorry, I haven't set up screen recording on here yet, so it will take a second for me to get it working because I have not used Zoom,
no worries,
the app before. I've always done it through the browser.
Yep, no worries.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm going to have to drop out a second because I have to reopen Zoom in order to be able to share my screen. Sorry.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We'll see you in a second.
Is it working? Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
And screen share. Where is it? Okay.
Yep, can see it. Lovely.
My slides. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to jump straight in here with an overly pedantic reading of a quote from Claire Harmon's 1989 biography of Sylvia Townsend Warner, wherein Harmon describes the Elfins as anarchic and amoral. Now, I know that Harmon is likely using anarchic in the colloquial sense here to mean chaotic, which is true to a degree. However, in the literal and the more political sense in which Townsend Warner would have understood it, referring to a society without hierarchy, it could not be a less accurate term for Elfinder. And I would take a brief aside here to note that in an interview she once said that if the English turn to the left at all, they are natural anarchists, to give an idea of some of her politics. Though I don't know how true this is historically proven to be. But elfin society is deeply hierarchical, a very pointed satire of real-world monarchies and aristocracy, and it is this very Gothic depiction of class hierarchy which I will be examining. And of course, all the best papers start off with dictionary pedantry. So a bit of context. Kingdoms of Elfin, Sylvia Townsend Warner's 1977 short story collection, is one of her oddest, most fantastical, and most Gothic works. The majority of her writings are realist historical fiction or poetry with threads of the supernatural and uncanny woven through them, but Elfin represents a stylistic departure, with the Gothic and fantastical brought to the forefront. The tales were written over a period of several years, originally published separately in The New Yorker, before being published as a collection about a year before Townsend Warner's death in 1978. The Elfins in these stories haunt ruined castles and windswept moors, occupying a world of excess and decay which lurks just on the edge of sight. The power of flight occupies two simultaneous symbolic positions in these stories. The first is as a marker of difference between Elfins and humans, specifically as a marker of Elfin superiority. In the first story in the collection, The One and the Other, which concerns the parallel fates of a human child in Elfheim and the changeling which replaced him in the human world, this is demonstrated almost immediately. Quote, Elfindom is an aristocratic society and jealous of its privileges. Before an elf baby is sent into the human world, its wings are extirpated and it is dosed with an elixir of mortality. Neither process is wholly satisfactory. The transfers die, but hardly and with extreme difficulty, and some have been known to hover briefly in the air. We learn three things here. Flight is a privilege reserved for the Elfins, and those that they reject are considered unworthy of it. The possession of wings becomes itself an in-group signifier and sign of belonging. And yet, the flight and the wings are not wholly correlated. An Elfin without wings is still capable of partial flight, which in human society ends up being erroneously linked to Christianity rather than the heathen Elfins. Excuse me. I would note here that Townsend Warner's relationship with organized religion was a complex and evolving one even late in her life, which I don't have time to get into here. The politics of flight are explained in this first story to Tiffany, the human child kidnapped and taken to Elfheim. He's told that servants, grooms, stable lads, people who went on errands flew because it was their lot in life, but in court circles no one dreamed of using his wings. Another story in the collection, The Late Sir Glamy, one of the last in the collection, members of the Elfin Court of Rings in Galloway discuss the essential distinction between Elfins and humans. The treasurer here suggests similarities. Also, I apologize for the photograph of text, but I did not have time to figure out all the formatting to put it on the slide, so I just took a picture of it. He suggests similarities, the same social structure, the same number of toes, he says. In these stories, barbs about our own society are plentiful, and this tiny sentence is possibly one of the most pointed. Elfin society is consistently portrayed as deeply decayed and corrupt, with a rigid class structure and archaic rituals dependent primarily on the whims of the powerful, disintegrating under the weight of their own isolationism and greed. One might almost be tempted to read some commentary into this comparison between Elfin and human society. And then in the story, the Chancellor also suggests that the essential distinction between humans and Elfins is wings. This bears up the suggestion from the first story that wings themselves are considered a privilege even if they are not used. And so we come to the second symbolic function, of the power of flight, as a signifier of class division within the Elfin world. We've seen how it divides them from humans, so now we will look at how it divides them amongst themselves. The cover copy of the first edition immediately introduces readers to flight as a class signifier. That's this image on the left here. For the upper classes, it is considered infra dignitatem, beneath one's dignity. In several of the stories, it's shown being used by working class fairies to achieve or facilitate their labor, in dusting the palace's chandelier, for example, or transporting parcels. In The One and the Other, Queen Tiffany describes the working class, quote, however useful and necessary they may be, as being no better than sparrows. Queen Tiffany herself, we are assured, quote, had never been known to leave the ground in all her 720 years. So what, then, is the purpose of having wings? Queen Tefane has spent almost 3/4 of a millennium jealously guarding the privilege of flight that separates her from humanity, but has not once used it even to spike them, for fear of appearing undignified. We see here that the strictures of elfin-class structures prohibit perfectly ordinary activities for fear of showing any common humanity, or elfinity, I suppose, between the upper and lower classes, anything which might reveal the unjust nature of the hierarchy between them. And to add a complicating layer to this class division, several of the stories feature aristocratic elfins who do break this boundary, either openly or in secret, which lends the lie to Tiffany's tutor's earlier words of no one ever dreaming of flying. Titania, the daughter of one of the courtiers, takes to flying in secret and relies on Tiffany to keep her secret because, quote, if it were known that Titania flew, her reputation would be lost. Despite this fear of social consequences, however, she grew so brazen about showing her wings that she even flew in public rooms, hovering overhead during state functions and harp competitions. And the use of showing her wings here suggests that there's possibly a modesty component to the prohibition against flight. And ultimately, the consequences of Titania's brazen disregard for this convention is left unknown, for Tiffany is expelled from Elfheim for the crime of growing old and unattractive, sent back to die among the humans. At his death, he fears that she may have been caught and caged, but we don't know if this is anything more than his fevered imagination. In the story The Climate of Exile, another aristocratic elfin, Eso Bodach, has been expelled from his home court for heresy, the heresy of believing that he possesses an immortal soul, which is considered to be, quote, an antisocial and subversive belief, and all mention of it is banned. Flight is involved in his heresy, as he was in flight when the realization quite literally struck him and knocked him from the sky, but it's not the direct reason for his exile. But once again, we see that the actual consequences for transgression are not necessarily linked to the specific transgression. The etiquette prohibiting flight is continually broken, openly or otherwise, but it is only enforced at the whims of the people at the top of the hierarchy. So I've looked through a few examples here which demonstrate the ways in which the power of flight is used as a class signifier, the ways in which elfin society has been organized around it, and the consequences, or lack thereof, for aristocratic elfins who break the rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan. That was really wonderful. Obviously, this kind of concept of flight and wings, very much of interest to me, because my paper was about de-winging. But can't wait to delve into some questions about that. And thank you both for sticking to time so well so far.
Right.
So lastly, we have Hannah Pike, who is from the University of Hertfordshire. Are you there, Hannah?
I am, yeah. Do you want me to tell my camera on, or shall I?
I'm just going to introduce you. You can share your screen in the meantime, please, if you're sharing slides. So Hannah Pike has studied English literature along with film studies at the University of Hertfordshire and has recently completed her undergraduate degree. She's published her own novel that was released in May of 2019, and it is a work of fiction based on the concept of Stockholm Syndrome. She's very interested and an avid reader of all genres, but particularly young adult fiction, gothic fiction and thrillers. And she hopes to continue further studies in literature with an MA course and possibly take that further to PhD level. So very exciting stuff. Her research interests are in the greater emphasis on identity in adolescence, along with how transgression and taboo relationships change their personality and self. Her paper today is Fae and the Other, Fae Identities as Threatening in City of Fae by Pippa d'Agosta. So thank you very much, Hannah.
So the City of Fae, let me just check. Can you all hear me and see me fine?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. So The City of Fae is the first book in a series called London Fae, which follows journalist Alina, who's a human, and a Fae superstar that she finds injured by a bus stop, unable to heal himself. So the novel on the blurb states that the Fae are beautiful to look at and dangerous to touch, which we all know rings true in terms of folklore and previous tales. But in contemporary fiction, young adult fiction, new adult fiction, it's become more focused on the negative aspects of the Fae and how monstrous they are. They're often presented as tricksters, looking for ways to manipulate and make deals with humans. This further sets fairies apart as the other in comparison to the human race. As Alina is only a human, she's slowly and cautiously drawn into the world of the Fae after helping heal the injured Fae superstar that she finds. The world of fairy itself and a lot of the spaces within the novel are particularly dominated and owned almost by the different species. So the setting of London is largely human dominated, and the land of fairy belongs to the Fae. So there's this further divide between the two species of human and Fae. And Alina herself finds herself caught between the two worlds of the Faes and the humans, because she is drawn into one but also has to protect the other. So the Fae world itself is a thing that humans don't understand and they don't recognize, because there's rules and limitations that to each world that the other species doesn't know of, as it were. So there also seems to be a mutual fascination in the relationship between humans and Fae. Fae leave changelings in the human world to cause destruction, and humans are left to almost pick up the pieces and try and deal with the changeling transforming and causing destruction. In recent adaptations of the Fae novels, like I said, there seems to be some strange fascination with the other world as well. And also, even though there is distrust and miscommunications and stereotypes between the two. Also, in medieval literature and folklore, there are certain stereotypes that have been set up from the very beginning, which influences contemporary novels, and the contemporary novels draw inspiration from them almost in the way that the Fae are presented. So we see a lot of the more monstrous, sort of demonized version of the Fae in comparison to, say, how Twilight's used vampires, and they've become more sympathetic and humanized as time's gone on. So overall, I think stereotypes and previous depictions of Fae have given certain rules and regulations on how Fae should be depicted in like across novels and fiction. But my question to you all is, if these rules or supposed rules were rewritten and we saw Fae in a different light, would they still be considered the other in recent fiction? Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That was really fabulous. So I'm going to invite people to pop their questions for our three speakers in the chat, and I will read them out and field them for you. I think there are a couple there already, but lots of love and lots of thanks for great talks in the chat there. So well done, everyone. Let's see, we've got one in the chat for Catherine. If you want to turn on your cameras and mics for this Q&A, please.
Sure.
Lovely. Kitty has just asked if there is a connection that you know about between the house carpenter and Natalie Merchant's house carpenter's daughter.
I'm not sure about that particular song. I'm not familiar with it instantly, but the House Carpenter is the name of the American version of The Demon Lover, like as a folk song more than a ballad, I believe. And Stephen Scobie, the author of the poem I just talked about, it's sort of a biographical hint that he knew of the Demon Lover legend and ballads. He was a huge fan of Bob Dylan and has written a couple of books about Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan did a recording of the House Carpenter. So I suspect that Natalie Merchant's song is probably related or inspired by, maybe a spin-off, but I'm going to look into it after our conference today. Thank you. Good question.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. We've got a lot of great comments about a lot of the texts you've all been talking about. One's just come in for Tam. So a question for Tam from Bill Hughes. Sylvia Townsend Warner satirises decadent ruling class as fairies, yet doesn't their magical, glamorous nature work against this in a way?
I think that she does sort of complicate that sort of aesthetic association, because her fairies are glamorous in the sort of the way that Terry Pratchett described them, as they create glamours and illusions, but they're not necessarily glamorous in a sort of fashionable and attractive way. They're described as sort of short and small and rather pointy and almost vulpine, I think, in their aesthetics. And so they end up being very sort of grounded and physical creatures that aren't necessarily presented as super attractive.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I have a question for Hannah. I was really interested in what you were saying about young adult fiction sort of deviating away from negative stereotypes from medieval literature and folklore. But I was wondering, in terms of fairy fiction, whether we're kind of now going back to a darker, more monstrous side of fairies, it's like rebelling against this 21st century super childish, friendly, sparkle dust fairies. What are your thoughts?
I think in some novels they do play up to that stereotype, especially with like a lot of authors that have been mentioned: Holly Black, Sarah J. Maas, I think her name is, and a few other authors. I think we are starting to go back to that whole they're devious, they're tricksters, etc. But maybe in some novels we're sort of sticking to that old stereotype of being childish and, you know, friendly and that sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure. It could be a bit of both. Yeah, absolutely. We've got another question just come in for Tam. They're fascinated by your aristocratic, I'm sorry, I can't say it. The aristocratic flightless fairies, especially with the way you framed them as satiric. I'm wondering, well, what may have inspired them? Perhaps Spencer, do you see any connection to the idea of a body politic or a body versus a body natural? There's certainly many representations of fairy monarchy carried on in litters or carriages, like Queen Mab.
Well, I think so. There's a few layers there, I think, to think about. One of the things that I have been thinking about in relation to Sylvia Townsend Warner's fairies is sort of the idea of the grotesque body versus the classical body, and from, I think, Rabelais, where the classical body is impermeable and unchanging, and in some senses the fairies are like that, because they don't necessarily age or die. But at the same time, she does kind of play up the grotesque aspects in emphasizing that they're hairy and often quite unappealing to be around. They don't bathe very often necessarily. And so it's maybe not quite related to the body politic idea, but she does kind of stray away from explicit political statements in these stories specifically. Obviously in her novels, for example, Summer Will Show, the heroine literally ends up distributing copies of the Communist Manifesto by the end of the book. But in the Elfin story, she does sort of remain a bit more, I suppose, guarded with her political messaging, sort of hiding behind that layer of satire. I think, but also with regard to the last part of the question, sorry, I'm going on a bit here. With regard to the fairy monarchy being carried around by other people, I think there is sort of the sense that they are sort of metaphorically carried through life by the work of others, but they aren't necessarily physically carried. There is a lot of discussion of fairies getting exercise, going on walks, and there is a suggestion that maybe some of the aristocratic fairies do sort of in secret use their wings for exercise. But it's this weird sort of everyone does it, but no one wants to talk about doing it kind of thing.
It's really interesting, thank you. I've got a question for all of you from Beverly, which is, are humans figured as threatening, the dangerous other? And if anyone wants to go first on that.
I think in some cases, I think as well with not just fairy fiction, but when you look at fantasy fiction in general, sometimes the human threats seem to be worse than the actual fantasy figures themselves. I'm thinking about Let the Right One In comes to mind, and a few others as well. Sometimes the human threat does override the fantasy figure threat, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one that comes to me is like a favourite childhood film, Fern Gully. Very much the monstrous human other in that film.
Sorry, I wanted to add as well that in Sylvia Townsend Warner, the sort of the human threat tends to be environmental rather than a sort of direct physical threat, because humans are sort of developing the land on which fairies live and sort of knocking down all these ruined castles and abandoned moorlands and turning them into industrial buildings and towns and things. But beyond that, humans are sort of viewed almost as almost pitiful and amusing. They're treated almost like pets rather than threats, I would say.
Interesting. Catherine?
Well, since the fairy or demon lover in the poem I was talking about is very much human, I think there are some dangers, and it's the types of human activity that are kind of characterized as demonic or fairy-like. You know, the enticing of the young Orkney men away from Orkney, like that was like historically that was 80% of the Hudson's Bay fur trader were drawn from the Orkney labor pool, and you can imagine the devastating effect that would have had on the Orkneys in terms of emptying out their young, able-bodied working force, and in terms of the impact on Canada. There was a danger that is just sort of brought in at the end when Isabel encounters the Indigenous family, or the fact that there's a country wife there who's sort of, been, married to this Orkney guy who can leave her at any time. That the impact of humans and sort of economic interests or corporate interests like the Hudson's Bay Company, that is a danger to these particular societies. But it's definitely depicted in more realistic terms rather than in the other two areas that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Another thing that struck me about your paper, Catherine, was that sort of the emphasis placed on the need to be buried back on your home soil, and that's how she wanted to go back to Orkney so badly. What do you have anything to say about the importance of sort of the earth, or this kind of supernatural importance on the earth where you were born?
Well, in the original traditional demon lover ballad, the woman in that, when she realizes that she's fallen for a really bad deal, that, you know, she's basically gone to what is described as a mountain of frost and snow. It's the mountains of hell where you and I will go. It's understandable that she would become homesick for her own turf, literally. And so Isabel goes through a similar thing, particularly when she realizes that she's pregnant and she's in this untenable situation. But I think it is, you know, the ballads, I quoted somebody, I think Alan Riek, saying that they represent universal human truths. And I do think that it is a theme with immigrants, migrants, that there's always an element of homesickness, you know, that you can never go back feeling, because when you do go back, it's never quite the same. You know, things have changed and you have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I found this panel absolutely fascinating. So thanks again to our three speakers. A lot of love and a lot of connections and sort of recommendations in the chat as well, based on your talks. So do have a look through.